There is a mountain in southern Italy that has seen more than 1,000 years of prayer and a few months of something else entirely. It rises from the floor of the Liri Valley like a fist, 518 meters of limestone and ancient earth, commanding every road, every field, every shadow that moves below it. For centuries, Benedictine monks looked out from the great monastery on its summit and saw nothing but the slow turning of seasons, olive groves and wheat fields, the distant glitter of the Rapido River, pilgrims climbing the long road in search of God. Then, in the winter of 1943, the soldiers came, and the mountain became something else entirely. It became a wall, a killing ground, a symbol so heavy with meaning that men from more than a dozen nations would throw themselves against it again and again, in snow and mud and fire, until the word casino meant something different in every language, something that had no clean translation, but that anyone who had been there understood immediately and completely. This is the story of that mountain, of the men who held it and the men who tried to take it, of the decisions made in headquarters far from the cold and the blood, of an ancient monastery reduced to rubble, and of how that rubble made the mountain harder to capture, not easier, of elite German soldiers, among the most capable fighting men the Second World War produced, who held a nearly impossible position for months against overwhelming Allied power, and of the cost that stubbornness extracted from every side. It is not a simple story. It never was. Wars are often remembered through their great turning points, the beaches of Normandy, the skies over Britain, the frozen hell of Stalingrad. Monte Cassino rarely gets that kind of clean, landmark treatment. It was not a single dramatic moment of decision. It was 4 separate battles spread across 5 months. It was attrition measured in meters and in men. It was the kind of fighting that does not make for easy monuments, because there was no clean heroism to carve into stone, only endurance, suffering, and the terrible professionalism of soldiers on both sides doing what they had been trained to do under conditions that would have broken most human beings. Roughly 120,000 men, Allied and German combined, became casualties in the struggle for this one stretch of Italian terrain. Think about that number for a moment. 120,000 human beings killed, wounded, or captured, for 100 kilometers of advance toward Rome. For a mountain, the mathematics of attrition have a way of making everything else seem abstract. But behind every unit of that number is a name, a family, a village somewhere that received a letter or a telegram and was never quite the same again. And at the center of the German defense, holding the Winter Line, holding the Gustav Line, holding Monte Cassino itself against 4 massive Allied offensives, were some of the most battle-hardened formations in the German military, the Waffen SS and their Wehrmacht counterparts. Soldiers who had already seen combat in Russia, in the Balkans, in North Africa, and who brought that terrible experience to bear on the slopes of an Italian mountain in the worst winter months of the war. This documentary is their story too, not a celebration of ideology. The ideology that animated the Third Reich was monstrous, and nothing in this film will suggest otherwise. But the men who fought on that mountain, whatever uniform they wore, were human beings caught inside a machine of industrialized violence that neither they nor the men attacking them had built alone. Understanding how they fought, why they held, and what it cost them is not the same as endorsing what they fought for. History asks more of us than simple condemnation or simple admiration. It asks us to look clearly, with both eyes open. We will trace the full arc of this story from the beginning, from Hitler's calculations about the Mediterranean, and the alliance with Mussolini that would eventually unravel so spectacularly. From the Italian surrender of September 1943 and the German occupation that followed with stunning speed. From the Allied landings at Salerno, a beachhead that nearly collapsed in its first 72 hours, all the way to the moment months later when Polish soldiers climbed to the shattered ruins of the monastery and planted their flag in the rubble, with the German defenders already gone. In between those 2 points, there is a story that winds through half a dozen major engagements, through bombing raids that turned medieval stone into jagged fortification, through river crossings in winter flood, through hand-to-hand combat in ruins that had once been houses and cells and chapels, through commanders on both sides making calculations about human lives that history has judged in very different ways, through ordinary soldiers, American, British, Indian, New Zealand, French, Polish, German, doing the extraordinary and terrible thing that ordinary soldiers are asked to do, which is to keep moving forward when everything in their body tells them to stop. So settle in, get comfortable. This is the kind of history that does not rush, because it cannot rush, because the men who lived it could not rush, and the least we can do is give their experience the time and attention it deserves. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. If you have found this channel before, then you already know that what we do here is take the long view. We do not shrink complex history into simple headlines. We do not turn real human beings into cardboard heroes or cardboard villains. We follow the evidence, we follow the logic of events, and we try to understand not just what happened, but why, and what it means that it happened at all. If that kind of slow, careful, honest storytelling is what you are here for, then we are very glad you found us. Hit the subscribe button, because there is a great deal more where this comes from, and we would like to keep making it with you alongside us. For now, though, dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the weight of the day go. What follows is more than 5 months of history, more than 1,000 years of a mountain story, and a cast of hundreds of thousands of human beings whose choices and sacrifices shaped the course of the war in Italy and beyond. The monastery on the summit of Monte Cassino was founded in the 6th century. It survived earthquakes, wars, and the long turbulence of the medieval world. It was rebuilt after destruction more than once. When the bombs of February 1944 finally brought its walls down, monks had been praying in that place for 14 centuries. The mountain endured. The question this documentary asks, quietly, carefully, over the hours ahead, is what that endurance cost, and who paid for it, and whether the accounting was ever truly made. Let us begin. There is a mountain in southern Italy that the ancient Romans called Mons Cassinus. It rises 518 meters above the valley floor, its stone flanks scarred by centuries of wind and war, its summit crowned by walls that have watched empires rise and fall. By the winter of 1943 to 1944, it would become the most contested piece of ground in the entire Western Allied theatre, a place where the ambitions of great powers and the endurance of ordinary soldiers collided in one of the war's longest and most punishing stalemates. But to understand why young men from a dozen nations bled and died on those slopes, you have to go back further. You have to understand the calculations that brought Nazi Germany to southern Europe in the first place, and the chain of strategic decisions, some brilliant, some catastrophic, that turned a sun-warmed Italian peninsula into a killing ground. Adolf Hitler never truly loved the Mediterranean. His strategic imagination was oriented eastward, toward the vast plains of Russia, and the agricultural and industrial wealth he believed lay waiting to be seized. The war against the Soviet Union, launched in June of 1941, was in his mind the decisive contest, the Darwinian struggle that would determine whether Germany would dominate Eurasia for 1,000 years or be consumed by what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. The Mediterranean was, in his initial strategic thinking, something of a sideshow, a theatre to be managed, not mastered. But the realities of alliance politics and coalition warfare do not bend to the preferences of any single leader, however powerful, and Hitler found himself drawn steadily southward by obligations and vulnerabilities he had not fully anticipated when he signed the Pact of Steel with Benito Mussolini in May of 1939. Mussolini had his own imperial vision. He dreamed of a new Roman Empire stretching from the Libyan coast across the eastern Mediterranean, and he had pursued that dream with a military that looked impressive on parade but proved dangerously fragile in combat. When Italian forces invaded Greece in October of 1940, they expected a quick victory and received instead a humiliating reversal, beaten back by a smaller Greek army. Fighting on mountain terrain, they understood far better than their attackers. When the Italian North African campaign began unraveling under British pressure in late 1940 and early 1941, Hitler was forced to intervene with what became the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel. Germany had not planned to fight in North Africa. It had not planned to bail out an ally whose military planning consistently overreached its capabilities, but the alternative, allowing Mussolini's regime to collapse, losing Italy's geographic position as a barrier between the Western Mediterranean and Central Europe, was worse. And so Germany's commitment to the southern theatre deepened, year by year, battle by battle, in ways that Hitler could not easily reverse, without consequences that threatened the entire architecture of Axis power. This tension between Hitler's Eastern obsession and the unavoidable demands of the Mediterranean shaped German strategic thinking throughout the middle years of the war. Resources poured into North Africa. Divisions that might have been resting and refitting in France found themselves shipped across the sea to Tunis, Benghazi, El Alamein. The Luftwaffe, already stretched across half a continent, contested the skies above Malta and the convoy routes that kept Rommel's forces fighting. Every tank, every litre of fuel, every shell that crossed the Mediterranean was a drain on a German war economy that was beginning to feel the strain of fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. And all of this, ultimately, achieved nothing permanent. By May of 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered, more than 200,000 men captured in a defeat that ranked alongside Stalingrad in its scale and strategic consequence. The loss of North Africa opened what Winston Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. The phrase was partly propaganda, partly genuine strategic conviction, the idea that the Allies could strike northward through Italy, draw German forces away from France and the Eastern Front, and perhaps knock the weakest member of the Axis out of the war entirely. In July of 1943, Allied forces landed on the island of Sicily, Operation Husky, and within weeks had overrun the island against German and Italian resistance that was, in places, fierce, but ultimately insufficient. Sicily's fall accelerated a political crisis that had been building inside Italy for months. The Italian military and political establishment had grown exhausted by years of costly war, by Mussolini's erratic leadership, by the steady accumulation of defeats. On the 25th of July 1943, the fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. The king had him arrested. The man who had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades was gone in a single night. Hitler's reaction was immediate and decisive, not the paralysis that his generals sometimes feared from him in a crisis, but a cold, rapid reorganization of priorities. He had wargamed precisely this scenario. German planners had long understood that Italy's commitment to the Axis was contingent rather than absolute, and contingency plans for a potential Italian defection had been prepared and held in readiness. The fall of Mussolini triggered those plans. German troops, already positioned in northern Italy on various pretexts, began moving south. Additional divisions were rushed through the Alpine passes. Commanders with experience in crisis management were assigned to the Italian theatre. Hitler was determined that Italy's collapse, which he regarded as a betrayal by a feckless ally, would not become a strategic catastrophe for Germany. If Italy was going to abandon the Axis, Germany would simply take Italy. It is important to understand what Germany was actually fighting for in Italy in 1943, because the stakes were different from those in Russia or in France. Italy was not about territory in the classical sense. Germany had no intention of permanently annexing the peninsula. What it was about was depth, time, and diversion. Every month that German forces could hold the Allies south of Rome was a month in which the Atlantic Wall in France could be strengthened, in which U-boat production could continue, in which Speer's armaments factories could maintain output. Italy was a strategic buffer, a place to absorb Allied effort and attrit Allied resources before the war's decisive confrontations arrived. And the geography of the Italian peninsula made it uniquely suited to this kind of defensive warfare. A narrow country flanked by mountains on one side and the sea on both, crossed by rivers that ran east to west at regular intervals like a series of natural defensive lines. Italy was, for the defender, a country almost designed by nature to resist invasion. These geographic realities were not lost on German planners, and particularly not on Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who would emerge as the dominant German commander in the Italian theatre. Kesselring, known to his troops as Smiling Albert, for a characteristic optimism that his opponents often found infuriating, believed that Italy could be held far longer than most of his peers thought possible. He argued against the early abandonment of southern Italy that some in the German high command favoured, insisting that fortified lines across the peninsula's narrow waist could exact enormous costs from any attacker. His arguments won out, at least partially, and the consequences would shape the entire Italian campaign. From the moment of Italy's collapse, German strategy in the peninsula was oriented around a single fundamental principle: make the Allies pay, in blood and time, for every metre of ground they gained. Into this theatre came the formations that would define the German defence, the Waffen SS divisions that were the most feared and, in many respects, the most capable fighting forces in the German order of battle by 1943. The Waffen SS was by this point a force that had evolved far beyond its origins as a political guard formation. It had fought on the Eastern Front with a ferocity and, it must be said, a brutality that had earned it a formidable reputation. Its soldiers were, on average, better equipped, better motivated, and more thoroughly trained than comparable Wehrmacht units. They were also, in the ideological calculus of the Third Reich, instruments of a racial and political vision that made them something more than ordinary soldiers in the eyes of their leadership. Sending them to Italy was both a military and a symbolic decision, a statement that Germany intended to fight seriously for the peninsula, not simply conduct a fighting withdrawal toward the Alps. The Italian surrender was formalized on the 8th of September 1943. Within hours, German forces had begun disarming their former allies across the peninsula. Operation AXA, or Axis, executed with a speed and ruthlessness that stunned many Italian commanders who had expected a more gradual transition. Entire Italian divisions were disarmed, and their men shipped north to Germany as forced labourers. Those who resisted were shot. The transformation of Italy from an Axis partner to an occupied country happened in a matter of days, and into the vacuum left by the collapsing Italian military, the Germans moved, establishing control of the major roads, the mountain passes, the port facilities, and the defensive terrain that would become the bones of their defensive system. By the time the first Allied soldiers stepped ashore on the Italian mainland, they were walking into a country that had already been remade into a German fortress. The road to Monte Cassino began, then not on the mountain itself, but in the conference rooms and command posts where strategic decisions were made, in the political crisis that ended Mussolini's rule, in the collapse of an African campaign that had promised so much and delivered so little. It began in the minds of commanders on both sides who understood that Italy's geography made it a natural killing ground and chose, for different reasons, to fight over it anyway. For the Allies, Italy was the path to Rome, to the symbolic heart of the ancient world, and to the disruption of German defensive planning in France. For Germany, Italy was a place to spend Allied blood cheaply, to buy time for the real battles that everyone knew were coming. And caught between these strategic calculations was a mountain, ancient, indifferent, and utterly commanding, that would become the center of one of the war's most extraordinary military contests. For months, the writing had been on the wall. Benito Mussolini, the man who had fashioned himself as the reincarnation of Roman imperial greatness, who had stood on balconies and roared promises of empire to cheering crowds, had led Italy into a war that was slowly consuming his country from the inside out. The Allied landings in Sicily in the summer of 1943 had cut through Italian defences with a speed that embarrassed every boast he had ever made. Food was scarce. Casualties were mounting. The Italian people, who had once celebrated his theatrical nationalism with genuine fervour, were growing cold. Within his own inner circle, within the very body that had given him his authority, patience had finally run out. On the 25th of July 1943, the fascist Grand Council voted against him. The man who had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades was placed under arrest by order of King Victor Emmanuel III before the night was over. The news reached Berlin like a tremor through stone. Hitler had not expected it, not with this speed, not in this form. He had known Mussolini was weakening, known the Italian war effort was faltering, but the image of his oldest ideological ally being removed by a palace vote and driven away in an ambulance was something that cut beneath strategic calculation into something rawer. His immediate reaction, according to those present that evening, was volcanic. He wanted to send paratroopers to Rome at once, to restore Mussolini by force, to crush any Italian government that dared negotiate separately with the Allies. His senior commanders urged caution. The situation was unstable, they said. Committing to impulsive action before understanding what the new Italian government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio actually intended could be catastrophic. Hitler listened, but he also began preparing. In the weeks that followed, German forces in and around Italy were quietly, carefully repositioned. Badoglio's government gave him exactly the window he needed. The new Italian Prime Minister famously declared that the war would continue alongside Germany, that Italy's alliances remained intact, that nothing had fundamentally changed. It was a lie told to buy time. Time to negotiate secretly with the Allies, time to avoid the immediate German occupation that everyone in Rome feared was coming. The Allies were listening. Talks moved through back channels, through neutral territories, through careful diplomatic concealment. All the while, German divisions were filtering south through the Alpine passes and across the northern plains of Italy, quietly reinforcing positions, quietly establishing control over key roads and rail junctions, quietly waiting. The German High Command operated on the assumption that Italian betrayal was inevitable. Every day, Badoglio maintained the fiction of loyalty was simply another day of German preparation. The formal announcement came on the 8th of September, 1943. Badoglio broadcast the armistice on Italian radio, the ceasefire with the Allies that his government had signed 5 days earlier in secret. The timing was partly forced by the Allied landings at Salerno the following morning, a synchronization that was intended to prevent exactly the kind of German reaction that came anyway. Across Italy, the announcement detonated chaos. Italian soldiers, many of them far from home and stranded without orders, had no idea what to do. Officers received no direction from Rome. The king and Badoglio had already fled the capital, boarding a ship for the Allied-controlled south. The government had essentially evaporated, leaving an army of hundreds of thousands without leadership, without instruction, without clarity about whether they were now enemies of Germany, friends of the Allies, or simply men waiting to be told what to happen next. Germany's response was the operation already waiting in the drawer. Operation Axis, in some German documents referred to as Operation Axis, was a pre-planned military directive to disarm Italian forces and seize control of the peninsula the moment Italy broke with the alliance. Within hours of Badoglio's broadcast, German units across Italy began executing it. The speed was not the product of improvisation. It was the product of weeks of careful pre-positioning, of units already holding key terrain, of commanders who had received their orders in sealed envelopes and been told to wait for the signal. When the signal came, the machinery moved. Italian garrisons across northern and central Italy were surrounded, disarmed, and in many cases dissolved within the space of a day or two. The largest army in the Mediterranean theatre was rendered militarily inert almost overnight. The scale of the disarmament was staggering. More than 600,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner in Italy alone, with hundreds of thousands more captured across occupied territories in Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Aegean Islands. Many surrendered without resistance, confused and leaderless, unwilling to fight men who had until yesterday been their allies. Others resisted and were dealt with harshly. On some of the Greek and Aegean islands, Italian units who chose to fight back were overwhelmed and, in at least one documented instance, subjected to mass execution rather than honorable surrender. A dark episode that demonstrated the fury driving German enforcement of Operation Axis. The Italian officer corps, in particular, faced immediate imprisonment or deportation to Germany, where many spent the remainder of the war in forced labor. The institutional collapse of the Italian military was total, and for the German High Command, almost deliberately so. A broken Italian army could not be reconstituted as an Allied fighting force. The occupation of Rome itself was swift and deliberately humiliating. German armored units moved into the capital with minimal Italian opposition, securing ministries, communication centers, and the approaches to Vatican City with practiced efficiency. The city that had been the symbolic heart of Mussolini's imperial ambitions was now a garrisoned German possession. The Italian population watched in silence or in fear, and many simply went home and tried to disappear. The remaining agencies of Italian state authority were dismantled or subordinated to German military governance, and in the north, Mussolini himself, rescued from his mountain prison in the Gran Sasso in a daring German glider operation, was reinstalled as the nominal leader of a new puppet state, the Italian Social Republic, headquartered at Salo on Lake Garda. It was a state in name only. dependent on German weapons and German will for every hour of its existence. South of Rome, the picture was more complicated. The Allied landings at Salerno on the 9th of September meant that the Germans could not simply roll across the entire peninsula unchallenged. American and British forces were ashore, and though the beachhead was precarious in those first desperate days, it represented an anchor that would eventually transform southern Italy into contested ground rather than occupied territory. German commanders under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring were therefore faced with a decision that had enormous strategic consequences: whether to withdraw behind a northern line or to contest the Allies as far south as possible, trading space for time, bleeding the advancing Allied armies across every river and ridgeline the Italian geography offered. Kesselring argued persuasively for a fighting withdrawal that would turn Italy into what he envisioned as a slow, grinding ordeal for the attackers. Hitler, whose instinct was almost always to hold rather than to yield, sided with Kesselring. The decision meant that the peninsula would be defended in depth, using the natural barriers of rivers flowing east to west and the mountainous spine of the Apennines as a succession of defensive lines. German engineers and construction units, supported by Italian civilian labor, began transforming the terrain into a series of fortified positions stretching from coast to coast. Roads were cratered, bridges were demolished as German units crossed them. Minefields were laid across valleys and hillsides. Strongpoints were established in villages, on riverbanks, on every commanding piece of high ground. The retreat northward was conducted with methodical deliberateness rather than panic. Each position held long enough to exact maximum cost from the pursuers before the next line was occupied. This was the strategic logic that transformed Italy from a potentially swift Allied passage into the grinding, slow campaign that would consume the next 2 years. The Germans understood that they did not need to defeat the Allies in a decisive engagement. They needed only to delay, to wear down, to force the expenditure of resources and lives at a ratio that made every kilometer of Italian soil prohibitively expensive. Every day spent fighting south of Rome was a day not spent reinforcing Normandy, a day not spent defending the Eastern Front, a day of relative breathing room for a Reich now confronting threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Italy, for the German High Command, had become a giant speed bump, one built from mountains and rivers and the bodies of soldiers on both sides. By October of 1943, German forces held a continuous defensive front across the width of the Italian peninsula, roughly south of Rome, anchored on the Volturno River. The formations assembling there included some of the most capable units in the German order of battle. Seasoned divisions hardened by years of war in North Africa and the Soviet Union, mountain troops trained in exactly the kind of terrain that Italy's central spine demanded, and elite Waffen SS formations, whose reputation for ferocious resistance had already been established on other fronts. The deliberate concentration of these forces was not accidental. Kesselring and the German High Command understood that the ground ahead, particularly the narrow mountain corridors north of Naples, would require defenders of the highest caliber. They intended to make the Allies pay for every step. The stage was set with a thoroughness that the Allied planners, for all their resources and air superiority, had not fully anticipated. Italy had been secured, neutralized, and turned into a fortress in a matter of weeks. The country that had crumbled inward from political failure and military exhaustion had been replaced, almost overnight, by a German military administration with clear defensive intent. Somewhere ahead of the Allied columns pressing north, a particular mountain was waiting, ancient, immovable, commanding the only practical road corridor to Rome. The Germans had already seen it, their engineers were already studying it, and the soldiers who would be asked to hold it, through winter storms and Allied bombardment and months of grinding attrition, were already finding their way there. The Gulf of Salerno glittered in the pre-dawn darkness of the 9th of September 1943. Somewhere beyond the Black Water, hundreds of Allied vessels held their position, engines idling, soldiers crammed onto landing craft with rifles across their knees and sick stomachs. They had been told the Italians had surrendered just hours before. Some men interpreted this to mean the Germans might not fight, that they might walk ashore into a country that had already given up. That comfortable assumption would not survive the morning. The Germans had anticipated an amphibious landing somewhere along the Italian coast for weeks, and the approaches to Naples through the Gulf of Salerno were among the most obvious choices on any map. As the first landing craft churned toward shore, German artillery crews were already tracking the engine noise in the dark, waiting. The Allied plan was called Operation Avalanche, and it carried the ambition of its name. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army would land on a broad front south of Naples, seize the surrounding terrain, and push rapidly northward to link up with the Eighth Army, advancing from the heel of Italy. If it worked cleanly, Allied forces would cut off German units in the south and establish momentum that could carry them to Rome and beyond within weeks. On paper, the sequential logic was elegant. On the beaches, it turned catastrophic almost immediately. German loudspeakers on the shore reportedly broadcast warnings to the incoming troops, telling them to surrender before it was too late. The men on the landing craft heard them, and they kept coming anyway, because there was nowhere else to go but forward. The beaches split into two main sectors. British forces under the 10th Corps landed to the north, while the American 6th Corps, under General Ernest Dawley, came ashore to the south. Between them lay a gap, a stretch of terrain where the two contingents could not easily support one another. German commanders identified this vulnerability with professional speed. The 16th Panzer Division, which had been positioned in the region specifically to contest any landing, moved to exploit it almost from the first hour of the assault. German tanks rolled to within hundreds of meters of the waterline at certain points. Soldiers who had just stepped off landing craft found themselves in direct fire engagements before they had even cleared the beach. The first hours on Italian soil for thousands of American and British troops were hours of raw, disorienting violence. The fighting in the initial days carried a quality of desperation that commanders on both sides recognized. Allied forces managed to push inland on some sectors, seizing villages and road junctions that provided at least a semblance of defensive depth. But German pressure was relentless and skillfully coordinated. Reinforcements from the 14th Panzer Corps arrived faster than Allied planners had expected, and by the 11th of September, the situation had deteriorated to a point that alarmed General Clark himself. The beachhead was shallow, poorly consolidated, and under attack along almost its entire perimeter. German armoured columns probed for weak points. Artillery fire reached the rear areas where supplies were being unloaded. The Navy was told to prepare contingency plans for a possible evacuation, a word that carried all the weight of Dunkirk 3 years earlier. It did not come to evacuation, but it came close enough to leave a scar. Naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers offshore proved decisive at several critical moments, blunting German armoured advances with volumes of firepower that no land-based formation could have matched. Aircraft flying in support hammered German columns attempting to concentrate for a final decisive push. General Harold Alexander, commanding the overall ground forces, threw every available resource into stabilizing the perimeter. Paratroopers were dropped directly onto the beachhead during the night hours, reinforcing sectors that were close to breaking. The margin between holding and collapse was measured in hours, and in the courage of individual soldiers who held their positions under conditions that would have justified retreat. The British sector around the town of Battipaglia saw some of the sharpest fighting. The town changed hands multiple times over the course of several days, each transfer bought at terrible cost in men and equipment. Soldiers fought through bombed buildings and across open fields with no natural cover, watched by German forward observers positioned on the higher ground inland. The hills that surrounded the Salerno plain formed a natural amphitheatre, and German commanders used it precisely as such, directing fire downward onto the crowded beachhead with devastating accuracy. For the men below, the sense of being watched and targeted without respite was a particular form of psychological pressure that wore at even experienced units. The American sector faced equally brutal conditions. Some units that landed in the initial waves were green formations encountering their first sustained combat, and the shock of the German response left entire companies disorganized and leaderless within hours. Officers fell with disproportionate frequency because the Germans understood that command and control was the first thing to destroy. Non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals, stepped into the gaps and kept their men fighting, not always with textbook precision, but with enough stubborn refusal to yield that the lines held. The ugly, grinding reality of combat leadership in crisis was on full display across the Salerno plain, and it was being conducted by men who had been civilians 2 or 3 years before. German confidence in the first days was not irrational. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, recognized that the Allied beachhead was genuinely vulnerable, and he pressed his subordinates to gather sufficient force for a concentrated counterattack that might split it in two. By the 12th of September, roughly 6 German divisions were engaged in or moving toward the Salerno sector. For a brief period, the arithmetic favored a German breakthrough. The counterattack that came on that day punched through American positions in the center of the beachhead, and for several hours there existed a real corridor through which German armor might have driven to the sea. Naval gunfire, air support, and the physical courage of small groups of soldiers who refused to move were the elements that closed it. It was a near thing in a way that official histories sometimes understate. What saved Salerno, ultimately, was the convergence of multiple factors that individually might not have been sufficient. The 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery was advancing northward from the south, and Kesselring could not commit everything to destroying the beachhead while that pressure existed on his other flank. Allied air power, operating from bases in Sicily and North Africa, made daylight movement of German columns increasingly costly. The supply of ammunition and fuel to the beachhead continued through the naval corridor, despite German air and artillery attack, sustaining the defense when it was closest to fracture. And the German formations themselves, however capable, had been fighting continuously since the opening of the Sicilian campaign months earlier. They were skilled and determined, but they were not fresh. By the 15th of September, the crisis had passed. German forces began pulling back from the most advanced positions they had reached during the counterattack, not in rout, but in the controlled, professional manner that would become characteristic of German defensive operations throughout the Italian campaign. Kesselring had made his calculation. He had probed the Allied beachhead, found it resilient, and concluded that a final decisive counterattack was no longer viable without unacceptable risk to his own forces. The order came to disengage and fall back to prepared positions further north. It was a decision that reflected not defeatism but strategic clarity. If Italy could not be held in the south, it could be made enormously costly to traverse. Salerno had taught Kesselring something important about what his forces could achieve. The Allied forces who came ashore in those tense days emerged from the experience changed. Clark's army had survived, but the experience had stripped away any remaining illusions about the Italian campaign being an easy avenue to the heart of Europe. The terrain, the German tactical professionalism, and the brutal arithmetic of amphibious warfare against a prepared enemy had demonstrated that every kilometre northward would carry a price. Naples fell to Allied forces on the 1st of October 1943, providing the major port that logistics planners desperately needed. But the city's fall was not the beginning of a rapid advance. It was the end of one phase and the opening of something harder, longer, and far more costly than most had imagined when the landing craft first ground onto the Salerno beaches 3 weeks before. The consequences of what happened at Salerno reached far beyond the beachhead itself. Kesselring's confidence that he could construct a coherent, sustained defense of the Italian peninsula was fundamentally shaped by what his forces had achieved in those first desperate days. He had very nearly thrown the Allies back into the sea. He had demonstrated that the Italian terrain was a defender's gift, that mountain ranges and river valleys running east to west could be fortified into successive barriers of extraordinary difficulty. This conviction drove the construction of the Winter Line, and, at its centre, the great fortress barrier that the Allies would come to know simply by the name of the mountain that anchored it. The road north from Salerno led, eventually, to a place where a 518-metre peak rose above the Liri Valley, and an ancient monastery looked down upon everything for miles around. The soldiers who had clawed their way off the beaches in September could not yet know what waited for them there, but the grinding logic of the Italian campaign was already pulling them toward it. The autumn of 1943 had delivered a brutal education to both sides of the Italian campaign. The Allies had fought their way ashore at Salerno, survived the counterattack, and begun pushing northward with the battered confidence of men who had nearly been thrown back into the sea. But the Germans had learned something too. They had learned that Italy was not simply a peninsula to be abandoned in an orderly retreat. It was a natural fortress, a geographic spine of mountains and rivers that, if properly exploited, could absorb Allied strength the way a stone wall absorbs the sea. Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, had seen this from the beginning. While others in the German High Command had favoured withdrawal to the north, Kesselring had argued for something far more demanding and far more costly. He had argued for a prolonged, methodical defence, a strategy that would bleed the Allied advance one river crossing and one ridgeline at a time. Hitler listened, and so Germany committed itself to turning the entire Italian peninsula into a killing ground. The plan that emerged was not a single line, but a layered system of barriers, each designed to slow, exhaust, and ultimately halt the northward drive. The outermost of these positions was sometimes called the Bernhard Line, a forward defensive screen running roughly from the mouth of the Garigliano River on the Tyrrhenian coast to the Sangro River on the Adriatic side. Behind it lay the true heart of the German defensive system, the Gustav Line. This was the primary barrier, the line Kesselring intended to hold through the winter and, if possible, into the following year. Stretching coast to coast across the narrowest part of the peninsula, the Gustav Line followed the course of the Rapido and Garigliano rivers in the west and the Sangro in the east. It was not merely a trench or a wire obstacle. It was an integrated defensive architecture built into the rock itself, designed by engineers who understood that terrain was the most reliable ally a defender could have. The geography that Kesselring's planners worked with was extraordinary. The Apennine Mountains form the central spine of Italy, and in the southern reaches of the peninsula, they push close to both coasts, leaving only narrow corridors of lower ground through which any large army must pass. The most important of these corridors was the Liri Valley, a broad, flat agricultural plain running northeast from the coast toward Rome. Control the entrance to the Liri Valley, and you controlled the road to Rome. That entrance was guarded, almost as if nature had placed it deliberately, by two natural bastions, the Abruzzi Mountains to the southwest and the Massif of Monte Cassino to the northeast. Between them, the Rapido River ran cold and fast, cutting across the valley floor. Any Allied advance toward Rome would have to cross that river, fight through those mountains, and somehow dislodge whatever force held the high ground at Cassino. Kesselring looked at this terrain and understood precisely what it offered. He ordered his engineers to make it impregnable. What followed over the autumn months of 1943 was one of the most intensive feats of military engineering the war had yet produced. Thousands of German troops, supplemented by forced Italian labor, worked through the cold and rain to transform the natural landscape into a prepared killing ground. Caves were widened and reinforced to create bunkers capable of withstanding heavy artillery fire. Machine gun positions were cut into the forward slopes of hills, sited to deliver interlocking arcs of fire across every approach route. Artillery observation posts were placed on commanding heights, where observers could call down fire on any movement in the valleys below. Anti-tank ditches were dug, wire entanglements were strung, and minefields were laid in dense patterns across the approaches to every river crossing. The work was relentless, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. By the time the first Allied patrols began probing the Gustav Line in earnest, the defences had reached a depth and complexity that would have surprised even optimistic German planners. The river obstacles alone represented a formidable challenge. The Rapido River, running swift and deep with winter rain, was not particularly wide, but width was almost irrelevant. The approaches to the river were flat, open, and dominated by German positions on every surrounding height. Any force attempting to cross in daylight would be visible from the moment it left its assembly area. Any force attempting to cross at night would struggle with the current, the cold water, and the certainty that German defenders had every likely crossing point pre-registered for artillery fire. The Germans had also ensured that the riverbanks themselves offered no natural cover. Trees had been felled, buildings demolished, and vegetation cleared to create open killing zones extending back hundreds of meters from the water's edge. It was methodical, almost clinical in its thoroughness. The men who designed these positions understood exactly what they were asking Allied infantry to walk into. Behind the river obstacles, the high ground provided the true strength of the position. Monte Cassino itself rose more than 500 meters above the valley floor, its slopes steep enough to exhaust even unencumbered soldiers, let alone men carrying weapons and equipment under fire. The ancient Benedictine monastery on its summit had stood for centuries, and its massive stone walls and commanding position made it an observation point of almost supernatural advantage. A German observer on those heights could see for enormous distances in every direction, could watch Allied supply columns moving on roads miles away, could track the assembly of attacking forces, could direct artillery onto targets that the gunners themselves could never see. Whether or not the monastery's sacred walls were formally incorporated into the German defensive line would become one of the war's most bitter controversies, but the mountain beneath it was unambiguously and comprehensively fortified. The lower slopes bristled with prepared positions, and the garrison assigned to hold them was among the best Germany could field. Kesselring's choice of formations for the Gustav Line reflected how seriously he took the position's importance. The divisions assigned to the Cassino sector were not second-rate garrison troops or exhausted formations pulled from other fronts. They were among the most battle-hardened and professionally capable soldiers in the German military establishment, including paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division, mountain troops, and elements associated with the Waffen SS. These were men who had fought in Russia, in North Africa, and in the brutal close-quarter battles of the earlier Italian campaign. They brought with them a tactical competence that had been forged in years of hard fighting, and they applied it to the defense of Monte Cassino with the methodical professionalism of craftsmen who knew exactly what they were building. The quality of the defender, combined with the strength of the position, would produce a combination that Allied planners consistently underestimated. By November of 1943, the Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. The forward Allied units, probing north through mud and rain, were running into the outer layers of the German defensive system, the Bernhard positions that screened the Gustav Line proper. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters, sometimes less, against defenders who had prepared their ground and showed no inclination to yield it without a fight. The optimism of early September, when some Allied commanders had spoken of reaching Rome before the year's end, had long since evaporated. The reality of the Italian winter, the mountains, the mud, and the German defensive genius was asserting itself with quiet, grinding authority. For the Allied soldiers at the front, the experience was one of almost unbroken misery, cold, wet, hungry, and under fire, from positions they could not always see and could rarely reach. The strategic implications of this stalemate were profound. Italy had been portrayed to Allied publics as a soft underbelly, a route into the heart of Axis Europe that would outflank the defences of northern France and bring the war to a faster conclusion. That narrative was already fraying. Instead of a sweeping advance, the campaign had become a costly attritional struggle against terrain and engineering that nullified much of the Allies' advantage in numbers, equipment, and air power. Soldiers who had trained for mobile warfare found themselves conducting something closer to the siege operations of an earlier century, advancing methodically against fortified positions, paying heavily for every gain, and looking at maps that showed Rome still impossibly far to the north. The German decision to stand and fight had stolen the initiative and imposed its own logic on the campaign. Kesselring understood the strategic value of what he had built. Every week that the Gustav Line held was a week during which German forces on the Eastern Front and in France could rest, refit, and prepare for the battles to come. Italy was a strategic drain on Allied resources, a commitment that absorbed divisions, aircraft, naval assets, and vast quantities of supply that might otherwise have been available for the decisive blow in northern France. From Berlin's perspective, even a defensive success in Italy was a meaningful contribution to German survival. The Winter Line was not merely a military position. It was a strategic instrument designed to buy time, and time, in 1943 and 44, was perhaps the most valuable commodity available to a Germany that knew it could not win the war outright. There was a particular cruelty to the landscape that winter. The Italian hills and valleys offered no shelter from the cold, which cut through every layer of clothing and settled into the bones of men who had been living in the open for weeks. Rain turned the mountain tracks into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles whole and made every resupply mission a struggle against the earth itself. For the Allied soldiers who would eventually have to assault the Gustav Line, this physical misery was the constant backdrop to the tactical problem. They were not simply being asked to attack a prepared defensive position. They were being asked to do it while cold, exhausted, wet, and inadequately rested, against defenders who had the advantage of cover, preparation, and ground. The disparity between the attackers' circumstances and the defenders was almost obscene in its scale. And yet the orders would come, the Allied High Command, under pressure from political commitments, from the need to draw German forces away from France, and from the genuine strategic importance of Rome, would not accept a permanent stalemate. The Gustav Line would have to be broken. The Rapido River would have to be crossed. The mountain at Cassino, with its ancient walls and its killing slopes, would have to be taken. What no one fully appreciated in the final weeks of 1943 was how many men would die in the attempt, or how many times the attempt would have to be made before the mountain finally yielded. The winter line was in place, the stage was set, and the most brutal chapter of the Italian campaign had not yet even begun. There is a place in southern Italy where the land itself seems to have been designed for war, not by generals or engineers, but by geology and time. The mountain rises from the floor of the Liri Valley with an almost architectural authority, its slopes falling away steeply on every approach, its summit commanding an unbroken panorama across the surrounding countryside for many kilometers in every direction. Standing at its base and looking upward, Allied soldiers in the winter of 1943 and 44 would have understood, at a single glance, what months of staff planning had failed to fully communicate. This was not simply high ground. This was a natural fortress of the First Order, and any army that held it would be extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The mountain is known as Monte Cassino, and its elevation of 518 meters above the valley floor translates, in military terms, into something close to total dominance. The Liri Valley stretches northwestward from the coast toward Rome, and for centuries it has served as one of the primary corridors of movement through central Italy. The ancient Romans understood its importance. Medieval armies used it, and in the autumn and winter of 1943, the Allied command recognized it as the most direct overland route to the Italian capital. But geography had placed a gatekeeper at its entrance. Monte Cassino sits at the southern threshold of the valley, flanked on one side by the Rapido River and on the other by a broken series of ridges and ravines that offered no easier path around. To advance up the Liri Valley, an army had to either neutralize or bypass Monte Cassino. Given the terrain extending on all sides, bypassing it was effectively impossible without exposing every supply line and flank to observation and fire from above. The mountain did not merely observe the valley, it controlled it. The slopes of Monte Cassino are deceptive in photographs. They appear rugged but manageable, the kind of terrain that fit and determined soldiers might reasonably expect to climb under fire. The reality was sharply different. The lower approaches are carved by deep gullies and ravines, created over thousands of years by rain washing through limestone and volcanic rock. These natural obstacles broke up any advancing formation, separating units from one another, channeling men into predictable corridors where defensive fire could be concentrated with devastating effect. The rock itself was a tactical factor. Too hard to dig proper foxholes quickly, it forced soldiers into the open, or behind stone walls that fractured into lethal splinters when hit by artillery. Snow in the winter months made the upper slopes treacherous even before the defenders had fired a single round. The mountain did not need to be fortified. It was already a fortress before a single German soldier set foot on it. At the summit, visible for many kilometers across the valley and the surrounding hills, stood one of the oldest and most significant religious buildings in the Western world. The Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino was founded in the 6th century by Saint Benedict of Nursia, and over the centuries it had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, by Lombards, by Saracens, by earthquake, each reconstruction adding new layers of architecture, art, manuscripts, and religious meaning. By the 20th century, the monastery was a complex of substantial stone buildings, arranged around a series of courtyards, its outer walls rising sheer from the rocky summit, like the walls of a medieval citadel. It housed one of the oldest monastic libraries in Europe, containing manuscripts and documents of irreplaceable historical value. It was also, simply as a physical structure, an imposing presence that could be seen from almost every point in the surrounding battle space. The relationship between the monastery and the German defensive position was one of the most debated and contentious questions of the entire Italian campaign. German military commanders were officially prohibited from occupying the monastery or using its buildings for military purposes, a restriction that was communicated to Allied commanders and that some among them believed and others deeply doubted. What was not in dispute was the military value of the mountain itself. The monastery's outer walls and the rocky terrain immediately surrounding them provided natural observation and cover that any competent defender would exploit to the fullest extent possible. Whether German soldiers were inside the sacred walls or deployed immediately below and around them, the military effect was largely the same. The high ground commanded every approach, every road, every crossing point on the rivers below. The town of Cassino itself sat at the base of the mountain on the valley floor, a compact urban settlement whose streets and stone buildings offered a further layer of defensive complexity. Any Allied advance would have to move through or around the town while simultaneously dealing with fire from the slopes above. The two positions, the town and the mountain, were mutually supporting in ways that a defender could exploit almost indefinitely. Troops sheltering in the rubble of the town were protected from direct observation from Allied positions. Troops on the mountain slopes could observe and direct fire onto attackers in the town. The two defensive zones reinforced each other, and German engineers and soldiers worked methodically through the autumn of 1943 to connect and fortify both. Mines were laid across every likely avenue of approach. Wire obstacles were strung across gullies and slopes. Prepared positions were cut into the rock wherever the terrain allowed. The history of Monte Cassino extended far beyond its role in the Second World War, and that history was not lost on the men who fought there. The monastery had survived barbarian invasions, plague, and earthquake across 14 centuries. Its walls had seen the rise and fall of empires. There was something almost mythological about the place, a quality that affected soldiers on both sides in ways they struggled to articulate. For the Germans defending it, the mountain represented an almost perfect alignment of tactical advantage and symbolic weight. For the Allied soldiers attacking it, it acquired over months of fighting a quality approaching the supernatural, an objective that absorbed men and effort on a scale that bore no reasonable proportion to its dimensions on a military map. The German 14th Army and the units subordinated to hold the Gustav Line understood precisely what they had in Monte Cassino: a relatively small number of defenders, properly positioned, could hold the summit and its approaches against a much larger attacking force for an extended period. The mountain compressed the advantages of the attacking side, numbers, artillery, air support, and expanded the advantages of the defender. Every step upward narrowed the front. Every ridge gained exposed the attacker to fire from the next ridge above. The attacker's numerical superiority was progressively cancelled out as the terrain funneled formations into smaller and smaller groups, while the defenders could shift reserves along interior lines to meet each new thrust. It was, from a purely technical military perspective, close to an ideal defensive position. The Rapido River, flowing along the base of the mountain's eastern side, added another dimension to the defensive complex. Crossing a defended river under fire is among the most hazardous operations in land warfare, and the Rapido, in the winter of 1943 and 44, was cold, fast, and overlooked from the high ground above. Assault crossings required boats, bridging equipment, and the suppression of defenders who could observe every move from elevated positions. Even when crossings were achieved, the troops who made it to the far bank found themselves in the open, exposed, with the mountain looming above them and defenders positioned on slopes that offered clear fields of fire across the entire riverbank. The river was not merely an obstacle, it was an integrated element of the defensive system, a moat that the mountain's height made almost impossible to force without catastrophic losses. To understand why Monte Cassino consumed so much Allied effort and so many lives requires understanding not just what the mountain was, but what lay beyond it. Rome was the prize, politically, symbolically, and strategically. The liberation of the First Axis capital would carry enormous weight in the propaganda war, would demonstrate Allied momentum, and would potentially reshape the political situation across southern Europe. But Rome was unreachable so long as Monte Cassino stood. Every plan, every alternative route, every attempted flanking maneuver ran back into the same fundamental problem. The mountain controlled the valley, and the valley was the road to Rome. No amount of tactical ingenuity could fully overcome a geographic reality of this magnitude. The monastery and the mountain became, over the winter and spring of 1944, something more than a military objective. They became a symbol of the war's capacity to consume everything placed before it. Men, machines, history, and the most carefully constructed plans of experienced commanders. The ancient stones of the Benedictine complex, built and rebuilt over more than 1,000 years of human civilization, now stood at the center of one of the most intense attritional struggles of the entire European war. Below the monastery walls, in the ravines and gullies and broken rock of the slopes, German defenders waited with weapons zeroed to ranges measured across every approach. And from the valleys and plains to the south, Allied armies began to assemble the forces they believed might finally be enough to break through what nature and military engineering had combined to make very nearly unbreakable. Before the first shot was ever fired at Monte Cassino, before the first Allied boot touched Italian soil, a very particular kind of soldier had already been shaped, forged in ideology, tempered in early war, and prepared for exactly the kind of grinding, unforgiving defensive combat that the mountain would demand. To understand what the Allies faced on those limestone ridges, you must first understand where these men came from, what they believed, and why, by 1943, they had become something the Wehrmacht alone could not replicate. The story of the Waffen SS is not a clean one. It is entangled with the worst crimes of the 20th century. But it is also the story of an institution that grew from a bodyguard unit of a few hundred men into a field army of hundreds of thousands. And understanding that transformation is essential to understanding the war itself. The roots of what would become the Waffen SS reach back to the earliest years of the Nazi movement, long before any dreams of continental conquest. In the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Adolf Hitler maintained a personal protection detail drawn from the most loyal ranks of the party faithful. These men were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were political enforcers, their purpose ideological and personal rather than military. The unit that would eventually grow into the Waffen SS began as the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, essentially Hitler's bodyguard formation, distinguished from ordinary party muscle by a stricter selection process, a direct oath of loyalty to Hitler personally, and a culture of absolute obedience. At that stage, few outside the movement would have predicted that this political militia would one day fight alongside, and often outperform, some of the most experienced regular army formations in the world. The transformation came in stages, driven partly by ambition within the SS leadership, and partly by the brutal logic of war itself. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS empire, understood that military prestige translated into political power. He pushed hard to expand SS formations into genuine combat units, a project that brought him into constant friction with the Wehrmacht's senior officer corps. The regular army viewed Himmler's soldiers with undisguised contempt in the early years, weekend warriors playing at being soldiers, in the private estimation of many a professional general. That contempt was not entirely without foundation at first. Early SS formations suffered significant casualties in France in 1940 from tactical errors that experienced Wehrmacht commanders would not have made. But the contempt would not survive the Eastern Front intact. Nothing in the war would remain unchanged after the East. By the time German forces plunged into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the Waffen SS had already been reorganized, re-equipped, and substantially expanded. What had begun as a collection of reinforced regiments was growing toward divisional structure, with formations like the Das Reich, Totenkopf, and the Leibstandarte itself now operating as full infantry divisions with their own artillery, anti-tank elements, and supporting arms. These were no longer ceremonial guards with political badges. They were combat formations operating in the most merciless theater of the entire war. The Eastern Front demanded things that no training exercise could simulate: the capacity to function under continuous pressure, to hold ground against overwhelming numbers, to attack when every instinct screamed retreat. The Waffen SS, whatever else it was, proved it could do those things. The cost was catastrophic. Casualty rates in some engagements exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had suffered in France or the Balkans. But out of that crucible came a combat reputation that commanders on both sides of the front came to respect, however reluctantly. Recruitment fed the expansion, and expansion fed the ideology, but ideology was never far from any of it. The initial selection criteria for Waffen SS service were deliberately designed to produce a particular kind of soldier. Physical standards were extraordinarily high by the measures of the time, with height requirements, medical examinations, and racial categorizations that reflected the grotesque racial theory at the heart of National Socialism. A man who could not satisfy the bureaucratic definition of Aryan ancestry would not pass through the front door of an SS recruiting office in the early years. Ideological instruction accompanied every stage of training. Recruits were taught not merely how to fight, but why they were fighting. A worldview built on historical grievance, racial hierarchy, and the mythology of a chosen people defending civilization against its enemies. This indoctrination was total, and it produced men who fought with a ferocity that went beyond military professionalism. They believed, with genuine conviction, in what they had been told they were. Yet the relationship between ideology and battlefield effectiveness was more complicated than either the SS's own mythology or its critics' simplifications allow. A soldier who believes absolutely in his cause may fight harder under pressure than one who merely follows orders, but he may also commit atrocities that a disciplined professional army would resist. The Waffen SS's combat record is inseparable from its record of war crimes, and any honest account must hold both truths together. Massacres of prisoners, reprisals against civilians, and participation in the broader machinery of SS terror were not peripheral to the institution, they were part of its character. Officers who excelled tactically, often bore personal responsibility for crimes that would later send them before international tribunals. The same formations that earned grudging respect from Allied commanders had blood on their hands that extended far beyond the battlefield. This is the weight that the name Waffen SS carries, and it cannot be set aside. The tension between the Waffen SS and the Wehrmacht ran through the entire war like a fault line, surfacing whenever command arrangements brought the two institutions into proximity. Regular army officers frequently resented the preferential treatment Waffen SS formations received in terms of equipment, manpower allocations, and political access to the highest levels of the regime. Waffen SS divisions were often given priority for the newest tanks, the best artillery, and replacement drafts when Wehrmacht units were left to make do with what they had. This created bitterness that occasionally spilled into open confrontation between commanders. On the other side, Waffen SS officers sometimes chafed under Wehrmacht operational authority, conscious that their men were being used as the army's shock troops without adequate recognition or support. The arrangement was workable in practice, but never genuinely harmonious. Two armed institutions competing for prestige within the same war. By 1943, the character of the Waffen SS had shifted again in ways that its founders had not entirely anticipated. The ideal of an ethnically homogeneous elite had begun to strain under the demands of a war consuming men faster than Germany could replace them. Volunteer formations recruited from occupied territories, Flemish, Dutch, Scandinavian, and eventually Balkan and Eastern European men, now fought under the SS banner alongside the original German cadres. The racial gatekeeping of the early years gave way, reluctantly and unevenly, to the pragmatic need for bodies to fill the line. The result was an institution increasingly divided between its founding mythology and the military reality of a war it was no longer certain of winning. Yet its core divisional formations retained the cohesion, equipment advantages, and institutional culture that made them reliably effective in defensive operations, which was precisely what 1943 required. It was the Eastern Front that truly defined the Waffen SS as a defensive force, and that experience would travel with these soldiers into Italy. The battles around Kharkov in the winter of 1942 and into 1943 were among the most demanding defensive and counter-offensive operations of the entire war. The SS Panzer Corps, comprising the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, was instrumental in stabilizing the southern Eastern Front after the catastrophe of Stalingrad. Under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's broader direction, these formations conducted a masterful series of operations that retook lost ground and stabilized a front that had seemed on the verge of collapse. It was in these operations that the Waffen SS's particular gifts, aggressive counterattack, willingness to hold ground under extreme pressure, and cohesion, even when partially encircled, were placed on the most visible display in the entire war. Their reputation after Kharkov was, by any military measure, formidable. That reputation was precisely why Waffen SS formations ended up in Italy at all. When the Italian front demanded reliable troops capable of fighting a defensive war against a materially superior enemy across difficult terrain, the calculus of German high command pointed toward elite formations with proven records. The Wehrmacht had capable divisions of its own, and they too would serve at Cassino. But for the most critical sectors, for the positions that could not be allowed to break, commanders wanted formations with the deepest reserves of institutional experience and the hardest fighting culture. The Waffen SS fit that profile in ways that political origins and moral complexity could not alter. Whatever they were soldiers who knew how to hold a line. There is a certain irony embedded in the story that follows. Men who had been forged in the political violence of the 1930s, who had fought across Russia in an ideological war of annihilation, would now dig themselves into an Italian mountainside and defend it with a professionalism that drew the reluctant admiration of the very enemies trying to kill them. The monastery above them would burn, the valley below would fill with the dead of a dozen nations, and the mountain itself would become one of the most contested pieces of ground in all of recorded warfare. But before any of that, there were the soldiers, where they came from, what they had been made into, and what they believed they were defending. The Waffen SS arrived at Monte Cassino, already shaped by a decade of politics, 2 years of the worst fighting in modern history, and an ideology that had promised them a certain kind of world. The mountain would have its own answer for that promise. By late 1943, the German High Command faced an unavoidable reality. The collapse of the Italian regime meant that Nazi Germany could no longer rely on its former ally to hold the peninsula. Instead, the Wehrmacht and its more ideologically committed counterpart, the Waffen SS, would have to shoulder the entire burden of defending against an Allied advance that everyone understood was coming. This defensive responsibility demanded not merely soldiers, but the finest troops Germany could assemble, men trained in mountain warfare, veterans hardened by years of combat, and units whose reputation for ferocity and discipline preceded them. The German leadership did not hesitate. They understood that Italy represented the soft underbelly of Fortress Europe, and that losing it would expose the southern flank to further invasion, and perhaps even endanger the Reich itself. Thus began the process of shifting elite formations from other theatres toward the Italian peninsula, a movement that would culminate in the concentration of some of Nazi Germany's best troops around the defensive positions known collectively as the Winter Line. The strategic architect of German defense in Italy was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a figure whose reputation for methodical planning and tactical flexibility would define the entire campaign. Kesselring possessed the rare combination of technical competence and political adaptability required to navigate the collapse of Axis Italy, while simultaneously preparing a credible defense against overwhelming Allied superiority in manpower and materiel. Reporting to Army Group C, Kesselring exercised overall command of German forces on the Italian peninsula, though his authority often proved contested by younger, more aggressive commanders who chafed under what they perceived as his cautious approach. Nevertheless, Kesselring's strategic vision proved sound. He would trade space for time, construct multiple defensive lines, and wear down the Allies through attrition rather than risk catastrophic losses in futile attempts to drive them back into the sea. Directly beneath Kesselring's command sat General Richard Heydrich, who assumed responsibility for the 14th Army, the formation most directly engaged with Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line. Heydrich, a career officer with deep experience in mountain operations, brought to his command a reputation for clarity of thought and an almost austere dedication to duty that commanded respect from subordinates and superiors alike. The command structure that Heydrich and Kesselring assembled would prove to be one of the most formidable defensive organizations fielded by Nazi Germany during the war. The primary German unit entrusted with the direct defense of Monte Cassino and its surrounding sector was the 1st Mountain Corps, or Armee Oberkommando, commanded by General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin. Von Senger embodied an earlier tradition of Prussian officer culture, educated, cosmopolitan, and possessed of a moral seriousness that distinguished him from many of the ideological fanatics who populated higher echelons of the Nazi state. He was, in many respects, the very opposite of a typical Nazi general, yet he remained bound by loyalty to the Wehrmacht and by the practical duty to defend his sector as capably as possible. Von Senger understood his responsibility with absolute clarity. Monte Cassino and the surrounding heights represented the keystone of the entire Gustav Line. If the Allies could break through here, they could pour into the Liri Valley, bypass the entire Winterline fortifications, and open the road directly to Rome. This knowledge guided every decision von Senger made, from resource allocation to tactical positioning, and gave him the moral authority to demand extraordinary sacrifices from the men under his command. Directly beneath von Senger's 1st Mountain Corps came the divisions and regiments that would bear the actual burden of defense. Among these, the 4th German Mountain Division emerged as one of the most heavily committed formations in the sector. Composed largely of men recruited from the Alpine regions of Bavaria and Austria, the 4th Mountain Division possessed a collective expertise in high-altitude warfare that proved invaluable in the terrain around Monte Cassino. These men had trained extensively in mountain operations, understood how to exploit narrow slopes and confined spaces for defensive advantage, and possessed the physical conditioning necessary to operate at altitude for extended periods. They arrived in Italy not as green recruits, but as battle-hardened veterans who had seen service in Greece, Yugoslavia, and on the Eastern Front. Alongside the 4th Mountain Division came regiments and battle groups drawn from other Wehrmacht formations, each selected for specific capabilities or because their original commands had been depleted and needed reformation. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation for uniformity, contained considerable organizational flexibility. Units were reformed, merged, and redistributed constantly as tactical needs changed and casualties depleted existing formations. Yet it was the Waffen SS formations that would come to symbolize German resistance at Monte Cassino and would bear a disproportionate share of the fighting. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, commanded by General Felix Steiner, represented the cutting edge of Nazi Germany's elite military formations. Steiner himself was a controversial figure, a career soldier who had remained somewhat aloof from Nazi ideology, while simultaneously embracing the organizational efficiency and aggressive doctrine that defined the Waffen SS. Under Steiner's command came the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, a unit whose very name testified to its ideological origins as Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard formation. By 1944, the Leibstandarte had evolved into a full-strength motorized division capable of independent operations, equipped with modern tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and air support. The men who filled its ranks were volunteers selected for political reliability, physical prowess, and demonstrated combat ability, though it should be emphasized that the notorious racial policies of the Nazi regime meant that recruitment had increasingly extended beyond the borders of the Reich itself. Alongside the Leibstandarte came other SS formations, including mountain troops drawn from the Wehrmacht and reorganized under SS command, each unit bringing its own particular specialization and combat reputation to the defensive effort. The hierarchical structure that emerged proved both efficient and somewhat Byzantine in its complexity. At the apex sat Kesselring, whose responsibility encompassed the entire Italian theatre. Beneath him operated General Heydrich's 14th Army, which controlled the broad southern sector, including Monte Cassino. Within the 14th Army's organization, von Senger's 1st Mountain Corps held direct responsibility for the Gustav Line and the heights surrounding the Liri Valley. Below von Senger came divisional and regimental commanders, men whose names and faces would become familiar to Allied intelligence officers and historians but whose primary existence consisted of making split-second decisions affecting the lives of hundreds of men under their command. Communications between these various levels of command moved along established channels, telephone lines when available, radio when necessary, couriers when both failed, creating a nervous system through which information, orders, and requests for reinforcements flowed constantly. The German army of this era, despite its reputation for rigid hierarchy, actually possessed considerable organizational flexibility that allowed battlefield commanders considerable discretion in tactical implementation. This flexibility would prove essential in the grinding attritional warfare that emerged at Monte Cassino. The composition of these forces reflected careful calculations about how best to distribute scarce resources across an impossibly long front. The total German strength in Italy by late 1943 amounted to approximately 400,000 men spread across the entire peninsula from north to south. Yet the concentration around the Gustav Line and Monte Cassino specifically proved far heavier, with battle-hardened divisions and regiments pulled from other sectors and rushed southward as intelligence reports confirmed the imminence of the Allied assault. Artillery formations accompanied the infantry, mountains of howitzers, field guns, and mortars positioned in carefully prepared firing positions that maximized their ability to rake any attackers ascending the exposed slopes. Engineer units worked feverishly to convert natural features into fortified positions, transforming caves and rocky outcrops into prepared defensive emplacements equipped with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Signal Corps personnel strung telephone lines and established radio nets that would allow commanders to maintain contact with their subordinates even in the chaos of battle. Supply personnel established depots of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement parts, creating the logistical infrastructure necessary to sustain a prolonged defense. This entire ecosystem of support troops, often overlooked in historical narratives focused on frontline combat, proved absolutely essential to the German ability to resist the Allied onslaught that lay ahead. The intelligence picture that guided German troop dispositions came from various sources: reconnaissance aircraft, reports from German observers in the forward positions, intercepted Allied radio traffic when decryptable, and the continuous stream of situation reports flowing from unit commanders observing enemy movements. From this cumulative intelligence emerged a clear picture that the Allies intended to assault the Gustav Line in the sector of Monte Cassino and the Liri Valley. German commanders understood, with almost prescient accuracy, that this position represented the inevitable flashpoint of the Italian campaign. They understood that the Allies possessed superior numbers and would achieve air superiority over the battlefield. They understood that German strength would necessarily be concentrated and that the margin for error would be minimal. Yet they also perceived opportunities inherent in the terrain itself. The mountain created a natural fortress that amplified the value of each defender, made the employment of Allied armor difficult, and forced attackers into precisely the kind of attritional infantry warfare where small numbers of well-positioned defenders could impose enormous casualties on attacking forces. By the time the first massive Allied assault materialized in January 1944, the German defensive preparations had reached an advanced stage of readiness. The 1st Mountain Corps had completed the initial phase of fortification around Monte Cassino and throughout the Gustav Line sector. Observation posts positioned throughout the mountains allowed German commanders to see approaching Allied movements almost before they occurred. Concrete bunkers, built by engineers using materials salvaged or captured from Italian fortifications, provided protection for critical defensive positions. Barbed wire, in quantities that staggered the imagination, had been strung across approach routes and positions. Anti-personnel mines and anti-tank obstacles were positioned to channel attackers toward kill zones where German machine guns and artillery could inflict maximum casualties. Supply lines were established and stocked with ammunition and provisions calculated to sustain the defenders through weeks of continuous combat. Medical facilities were prepared to handle the inevitable casualties, with dressing stations and field hospitals positioned to provide treatment while remaining within reasonable distance of the front lines. The reinforcement process that continued throughout the winter and into spring 1944 reflected the German High Command's mounting concern about the sustainability of the position. As the initial assaults unfolded, and it became clear that the Allies would persist in their efforts to break through at Monte Cassino, additional formations were stripped from other sectors and dispatched southward. Fresh divisions arrived from Germany itself, units that had been held in reserve or that could be spared from other threatened sectors. Replacement personnel, drawn from depot companies and from recovered wounded returning to duty, continually replenished the losses inflicted by the relentless combat. Tank destroyers and self-propelled guns were rushed forward to provide anti-tank defense and firepower in positions where conventional tanks could not operate effectively on the mountainous terrain. The German logistics system, despite the enormous strain imposed by fighting on multiple fronts and under conditions of air superiority, continued to supply these reinforcements and maintain the defensive effort. This process of continuous reinforcement, continuation, and regeneration became the defining characteristic of the German defense at Monte Cassino. Not a static wall that would either hold or break, but a dynamic, evolving system that absorbed blows and reformed, that suffered losses and received replacements, that bent under pressure but maintained structural integrity. The commander corps that emerged from this reinforcement process represented something approaching the absolute cream of Nazi Germany's military establishment. These were men who had survived years of combat, who possessed proven tactical ability and leadership capacity, and who understood the gravity of their task. They came from different backgrounds. Some were aristocratic Prussians of the old school, others rose from more modest origins and had climbed the military hierarchy through demonstrated competence. Some held Nazi Party memberships and embraced the ideological dimensions of the regime they served, while others performed their duties while maintaining emotional distance from Nazi ideology. What united them was expertise, the clear-eyed acceptance that they faced a formidable enemy, and the determination to inflict maximum casualties on the Allies even as they gradually lost ground. These commanders understood that they were participating in a holding action, that victory in the conventional sense had become impossible, yet they also understood that time purchased at Monte Cassino might be time gained elsewhere in Europe. Thus they prosecuted their defense with the grim professionalism of men who understand their duty, even if that duty leads inexorably toward defeat. By the eve of the first Allied assault in January 1944, the German order of battle around Monte Cassino represented a formidable concentration of military power. The 1st Mountain Corps, under von Senger und Etterlin, disposed of forces that totaled somewhere in the region of 70,000 men, directly assigned to the Gustav Line sector. These forces included mountain troops, SS formations, Wehrmacht infantry divisions, artillery regiments, engineer battalions, and all the supporting elements necessary to sustain combat operations. They were positioned in carefully prepared defensive lines that exploited every feature of the terrain, supplied with quantities of ammunition and provisions that should sustain them through weeks of heavy fighting, and commanded by officers and NCOs selected for their competence and their ability to lead men under conditions of extreme stress. Behind them lay additional reserves that could be committed to critical sectors, fresh formations that could reinforce threatened positions, and the entire German military-industrial complex, stretched to its absolute limits, but still capable of producing the weapons, ammunition, and supplies necessary to continue the struggle. The stage was thus set for one of the war's most brutal and attritional campaigns, a test of will, leadership, and the ability of men to endure suffering and continue fighting despite mounting evidence that ultimate victory had become impossible. The German forces at Monte Cassino, whatever one's judgment of their cause or their broader allegiances, represented perhaps the most formidable defensive force that would be arrayed against the Allies anywhere in the European theatre during 1944. The winter of 1943 gave way to 1944, and across the Mediterranean, the Allies prepared to break the German deadlock. The Winter Line, that formidable chain of fortifications stretching across the Italian peninsula, had brought the rapid advance of the previous autumn to a grinding halt. Behind these concrete and earthen barriers stood German soldiers, disciplined, prepared, and utterly resolved to hold what they had been ordered to defend. Among them were the men of the Waffen SS, elite formations stiffened with the fanaticism that had made them feared across Europe. But January 1944 would test both attackers and defenders in ways neither side had fully anticipated. The opening battles around Monte Cassino would establish the pattern of sacrifice and frustration that would characterize the entire Italian campaign. The American Fifth Army, under General Mark Clark, had spent weeks planning the assault on the Winter Line. Intelligence reports suggested the German garrison was stretched thin, overextended across a vast defensive front, with insufficient reserves to hold everywhere at once. This assessment would prove catastrophically optimistic. What American commanders did not fully grasp was the quality and determination of the forces arrayed against them, and more crucially, the natural advantages that terrain itself conferred upon the defense. The Germans had not chosen Monte Cassino by accident. The mountain dominated the Liri Valley, the only practical route northward toward Rome. From its slopes, German observers could see every movement of the approaching Americans. From its heights, German artillery and machine guns could rain down fire upon any force attempting to assault upward. The geography itself had become a fortress, and the Germans had amplified its natural defenses with concrete, wire, and carefully prepared killing zones. On the morning of the 17th of January 1944, American units began their approach toward the mountain's lower slopes. The Second Corps, composed largely of inexperienced soldiers who had seen limited combat, advanced cautiously across terrain that offered no concealment and minimal tactical advantage. These were men drawn from farms in Iowa, cities in Pennsylvania, small towns across the heartland, citizen soldiers thrust into a grinding continental war that had little resemblance to anything they had trained for in the American South. Their officers were competent enough, but many were also learning the craft of modern warfare through bitter experience. As they moved forward, they encountered the first German defensive positions, artillery fire that scattered their formations, machine gun barrages that forced them to ground, and counterattacks from well-positioned German troops who seemed to appear from nowhere. The mountain itself became the enemy as much as the soldiers defending it. The slopes were steep, exposed, and exhausting to climb in winter conditions. The fighting around the slopes of Monte Cassino during mid-January was characterized by confusion, frustration, and mounting American casualties. Units became disoriented in terrain that proved far more difficult than maps had suggested. German artillery, positioned with meticulous care over months of preparation, fell upon American concentrations with devastating accuracy. Entire companies found themselves pinned in the open, unable to advance, reluctant to retreat, waiting for the bombardment to cease and the counterattack to come. Officers called for supporting fire, artillery, air support, anything to suppress the German guns. But the weather that month was consistently foul. Clouds hung low over central Italy. Rain and mist reduced visibility to mere meters in places. Air support became impossible for days at a time. The Allies' greatest advantage, overwhelming aerial superiority, could not be brought to bear. The Germans, by contrast, did not rely on air power. They relied on concrete, artillery, discipline, and the advantage of high ground. By the 20th of January, it became clear that the initial American assault would not break through quickly. The troops attacking toward Monte Cassino had suffered heavily without making decisive progress. German units, though outnumbered on the ground, were fighting with the skill and determination that had earned the Waffen SS its fearsome reputation. German counterattacks were executed with textbook precision, infantry advancing in waves, supported by well-placed machine gun fire, striking at American positions before withdrawing before the Americans could consolidate. The American commanders realized that whatever they had expected, the reality was proving far more costly. Casualty figures mounted daily. Medical stations overflowed with wounded men. The supply lines, already stretched thin, groaned under the burden of supporting an offensive that was consuming ammunition, fuel, and food at astronomical rates. Yet the defenders held their ground. The attempt to bypass Monte Cassino and attack it from the side offered promise at first, but proved equally costly. The terrain beyond the mountain was rough, mountainous, and equally well defended. German forces had not fortified just the main peak. They had created a network of defensive positions across the entire massif. Artillery observation posts on the mountain itself could direct fire against any American movement anywhere within the valley. A ridgeline west of Monte Cassino, later designated Hill 421 by the Americans, became a secondary focus of the fighting. It was captured and lost, and captured again in a series of desperate assaults that achieved nothing except to pile American bodies into the frozen Italian soil. The German defenders, though suffering their own losses, could fall back to prepared positions and continue fighting. The Americans, attacking uphill and exposed, had no such advantage. Each assault cost more lives than the last. By late January, the dimensions of the problem became undeniable even to the most optimistic commanders. The German defense was not cracking. The winter line was functioning precisely as designed, a series of interlocking positions that made flanking movements impossible, that forced the Allies into costly frontal assaults, and that allowed limited reserves to compensate for numerical inferiority through superior defensive positioning. American casualty figures had reached catastrophic levels for an advance that had gained mere kilometers. The soldiers of the Second Corps, many of them seeing serious combat for the first time, were learning harsh lessons about mechanized warfare. Machine guns were more effective on defense than rifles were on attack. Entrenching tools and concrete were worth more than courage when the enemy held the high ground. Small unit tactics that worked in theory fell apart in practice when executed by exhausted, frightened, inexperienced men stumbling through cold mud toward prepared German positions. Intelligence analysts began reviewing reports from the front with growing alarm. The forces the Germans had committed to Monte Cassino appeared to be smaller than expected, yet they were holding the mountain against assaults that had mobilized entire American divisions. How was this possible? The Germans were executing what military theorists called elastic defense in depth, pulling back from the outermost positions to more defensive lines when under overwhelming pressure, then counter-attacking to retake lost ground. This required both discipline and confidence from the troops executing it. It required commanders who understood the terrain intimately and who could coordinate movements across broken ground. It required reserves positioned to strike quickly at American breakthroughs before they could be consolidated. The Waffen SS units in the sector possessed exactly these qualities. They were trained for mountain warfare. They fought with a cohesion that distinguished them from average Wehrmacht formations, and they fought with an ideological conviction that made retreat an option only when ordered. The first major assault on Monte Cassino had been launched with the assumption that German forces would be overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. American strategy rested on the premise that once a breakthrough was achieved, exploitation would follow. Mechanized forces would pour through the gap, encircle German defenders, and break the entire winter line. Instead, the Americans found themselves committed to a grinding war of attrition against defenders who had no intention of obliging them with rapid collapse. The narrow frontal attacks became an exhausting slog up steep slopes against diminishing returns. Every American company that attacked lost men. Every company that survived withdrew with fewer soldiers than it had begun with. Replacements arrived, but they were untrained, unprepared for the conditions, and quickly became casualties themselves. By the end of January 1944, American operations around Monte Cassino had stalled. The initial offensive had been called off without achieving the breakthrough that everyone had anticipated. The mountain remained firmly in German hands. American casualties had approached 10,000 men for an advance measured in mere kilometers. The commanders on the ground had learned an important tactical lesson: that mountains defended by determined troops armed with modern weapons could not be assaulted directly without enormous cost. But this knowledge came at an appalling price in American lives. The soldiers who had fought in January would not be the same soldiers who fought in the battles to come. Many would not survive to fight at all. The failure of the January offensive exposed the fundamental challenge that the Allies faced in Italy. The winter line could not be breached by maneuver in broken terrain. It could not be bypassed because the mountains themselves were impassable to mechanized forces. It could not be assaulted frontally without casualties that would mount exponentially with each new attempt. The Germans, by contrast, had chosen their position brilliantly. They held terrain that rendered the Allies' advantages: air power, mechanized transport, numerical superiority, far less effective than they would be in open country. The Allies possessed overwhelming naval power, control of the air, and the ability to land behind German lines through amphibious assault. Yet Monte Cassino sat inland, beyond the range of naval gunfire, in terrain where aircraft could barely operate, and far from the sea. The tactical lesson of January 1944 was stark and unforgiving. Frontal assault against prepared defenses could not succeed without overwhelming local superiority and willingness to accept terrible casualties. The Germans had demonstrated that elite troops, properly positioned and well led, could hold mountainous terrain against numerically superior forces, using tactics that exploited the terrain itself as a weapon. The Waffen SS units defending Monte Cassino had fought with skill, discipline, and determination. They had bloodied the American army and sent it reeling backward. Yet this was only the first of 4 major assaults that would be launched against the mountain. The Allies would not abandon the position. They would return again and again with more men, more artillery, more aircraft, and each time they would accept greater casualties in pursuit of an objective that seemed to grow more important with every failed attempt. The mountain had begun its transformation into something larger than itself, a symbol of Allied determination, a monument to German resilience, and a grinding millstone that would consume the youth of multiple nations before it finally fell. In the opening days of February 1944, the American commanders facing Monte Cassino confronted a problem that had no simple solution. The mountain had resisted 3 weeks of costly assault. Infantry units had climbed and died on its lower slopes. Tank support was nearly impossible on terrain so steep and broken. The weather remained brutal, with snow and rain transforming the battlefield into a world of mud and suffering. Yet the monastery perched on the summit seemed to offer something that no amount of courage or firepower could overcome: a perfect observation post overlooking every Allied movement in the valley below. The question that began to dominate American thinking was whether that monastery, one of Christianity's most sacred sites, founded in the 6th century by Saint Benedict himself, was actually serving as a German strongpoint. The answer would set in motion one of the war's most controversial decisions. The intelligence picture was murky at best. American observers had spotted German soldiers in the monastery grounds. Radio intercepts suggested that German engineers were improving positions on the heights. Interrogated prisoners claimed they had seen Germans moving through the cloisters and setting up observation equipment in the tower. Yet no concrete proof emerged. No photographs definitively showed artillery pieces inside the walls. No captured German orders explicitly authorized the use of the monastery as a fortress. The German command structure, meanwhile, publicly denied any military use of the sacred building. General Freiler, the senior German commander in the sector, sent word through neutral sources that the monastery was off-limits to German forces, that it stood as neutral ground in the midst of warfare. This claim carried weight in certain quarters. Yet the tactical reality remained unchanged. Whatever the monastery's formal status, German observers on that summit possessed an overwhelming advantage. The debate that unfolded in the Allied command became a clash between military necessity and cultural conscience. American officers argued that the monastery, whether formally militarized or not, functioned as a German strongpoint simply by virtue of its location. From those heights, German spotters could direct artillery fire onto American positions with devastating accuracy. They could observe every reinforcement, every supply column, every fresh assault before it developed. In warfare, advantage mattered more than intentions. The presence of German soldiers anywhere on the mountain meant the monastery could not be treated as genuinely neutral. Other voices, however, including some within the Catholic Church and among cultural authorities, urged restraint. The monastery was not merely a building, but a symbol of Western civilization itself. Its destruction would be a blow to Christendom, a betrayal of the very values the Allies claimed to defend against barbarism. To bomb it would be to prove that even the Western democracies, in their desperation, could commit acts of cultural vandalism. General Bernhard Freyler, commanding the German defences, made a calculated public gesture. On the 4th of February, he issued an order forbidding German troops from occupying the monastery itself or using it as a military installation. Whether this order was enforced completely or merely existed for propaganda purposes remains disputed by historians. What is certain is that German positions were established on the slopes surrounding the monastery, within clear sight of the summit, but technically outside the sacred walls. German observers operated in buildings in the monastery compound, but not in the monastery proper. German artillery spotters used terrain features and observation posts that offered clear lines of sight to the abbey, but could claim they were not inside its confines. It was a distinction without meaningful difference, and the American commanders knew it. Yet the gesture provided diplomatic cover for what was increasingly being contemplated. The decision crystallized in early February. General Sir Harold Alexander, the overall Allied commander in Italy, requested that the monastery be bombed. General Mark Clark, commanding the American Fifth Army, supported the recommendation. The assumption was straightforward. The monastery functioned as a German military position because its location made it militarily decisive. Whether German soldiers technically occupied the building itself was secondary. What mattered was that the monastery's existence as a dominating terrain feature gave the Germans an insurmountable advantage. Bomb it, the reasoning went, and that advantage would vanish. The rubble of a destroyed monastery would be less useful for observation than an intact one. The psychological effect on the German defenders would be profound. The demoralizing effect on the Allies would be lifted. After weeks of failure and mounting casualties, here was a tool that might unlock the stalemate. The order was transmitted to the Strategic Air Command. On the 12th of February 1944, in the early morning hours, the decision transformed into action. Wave after wave of American bombers, 456 heavy bombers, 256 medium bombers, descended through the alpine winter sky toward Monte Cassino. The bombardment lasted approximately 4 hours. The tonnage of ordnance dropped on the monastery, and its immediate surroundings exceeded 1,000 tons. The explosion could be heard for miles. The impact was total. The ancient structure that had stood for 1,300 years, that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that had preserved knowledge through the Dark Ages, was reduced to rubble. Smoke rose in massive columns. Stone dust hung in the air for hours. When the bombing ceased, little remained of the monastery, but broken walls, collapsed arches, and the twisted remains of centuries of history. The immediate consequence was a shock that rippled through the Western world. Catholic populations in America, Britain, and elsewhere protested the destruction. Vatican officials issued statements of protest and mourning. Cultural authorities denounced the bombing as an act of barbarism, a stain on the Allies' moral authority. Newspapers ran photographs of the destruction. Debates raged in parliaments and churches about whether military necessity could ever justify such cultural devastation. The German propaganda machine seized upon the bombing as proof of Allied hypocrisy and brutality. The narrative emerged that the Allies, claiming to fight for civilization, had destroyed one of civilization's most sacred monuments. For the Germans, it was a propaganda victory at virtually no cost. For the Allies, it was a political disaster that would complicate their moral narrative for the remainder of the war. Yet the military logic that had motivated the bombing contained a fatal flaw. The German command, despite the loss of the monastery structure itself, discovered that the rubble actually improved their defensive positions. Broken stone, rubble piles, and collapsed walls provided better cover and concealment than the intact monastery had offered. German engineers transformed the ruins into a maze of defensive positions, fortified by the very destruction meant to dislodge them. The observation posts that the Allies had hoped to eliminate simply relocated to positions within and behind the rubble. German soldiers used the debris as natural fortifications. The open slopes were now partially obscured by fragmented stone. The tactical advantage that the bombing was supposed to eliminate instead multiplied. Within days, German defenders were more firmly entrenched than before. The Allies, having destroyed one of Christendom's great treasures, had gained nothing. The stalemate persisted. The intelligence that had justified the bombing proved incomplete and partly erroneous. No definitive evidence emerged that German soldiers had formally occupied the monastery interior in significant numbers. Interrogations of captured Germans, conducted after the war, suggested that the formal German order prohibiting military use of the monastery had been largely observed, at least before the bombing itself. This is not to say the monastery was neutral. It was not. Soldiers passed through it. Supplies were stored nearby. It served as a landmark and navigation point. But the specific military purpose for which it was bombed appeared never to have fully existed. German defenders were on the mountain, using the terrain, but not necessarily embedded within the monastery walls. The bombing had been justified by assumptions that, even if partially correct, had failed to account for the defensive value of destruction itself. The aftermath unfolded in the weeks and months that followed. The second major Allied offensive against Monte Cassino would be launched after the monastery's destruction, featuring New Zealand and Indian forces. These troops would find the ruins as problematic as the intact structure had been. German defenders, now fortified by rubble, would fight with undiminished determination. Casualties would mount. The psychological effect the Allies had anticipated, demoralization of German troops and motivation for Allied soldiers, proved largely illusory. German soldiers fighting among the ruins of a monastery they had not destroyed could claim moral standing. Allied soldiers, aware that their command had ordered the bombing, experienced ambivalence and doubt. The decision that seemed militarily rational had become morally complicated. The symbol of Western strength and civilization had become, through a single morning's bombardment, a symbol of moral ambiguity. General Alexander and General Clark would defend the bombing as a military necessity for the remainder of their lives. They noted that every available option for breaking the stalemate had been exhausted through conventional means. The monastery's location made it militarily dominant, they maintained, regardless of whether German soldiers formally occupied its interior. The destruction was regrettable but unavoidable. This explanation satisfied some, but not others. Pope Pius XII issued a statement expressing sorrow, but not condemnation, a carefully calibrated response that reflected the Vatican's own ambivalence. American Catholic organizations remained divided on whether the bombing had been justified. British commanders, somewhat more removed from the decision, expressed greater skepticism about its military value. As weeks passed and the monastery's ruins proved no more surrendering than the intact structure had been, doubts deepened. Had the bombing accomplished anything except destruction? The legacy of the monastery bombing became inseparable from the larger tragedy of Monte Cassino itself. In destroying an ancient symbol of European culture in the attempt to break German resistance, the Allies had illustrated one of warfare's fundamental contradictions, that the costs of victory sometimes exceed its benefits, and that tactical actions can carry strategic consequences that ripple far beyond the battlefield. The monastery's destruction would be remembered long after the specific military situation that prompted it had been forgotten. It became an emblem of the war's grinding attrition, its moral complexity, and the terrible choices that absolute warfare demanded of its participants. The Germans had claimed not to occupy it. They had been vindicated by history. The Allies had destroyed it. They had paid a price in moral standing that would never be fully recovered. The mountain itself had witnessed the contradiction and stood mute, still unbroken, still defending the valley below, still German in its allegiance despite the absence of its summit's ancient shrine. The bombing of the monastery had not broken German resolve. If anything, it had hardened it. In the days following the destruction of the Benedictine sanctuary on the 12th of February, German commanders studied the rubble with cold calculation. The ancient stones, pulverized by ordnance, had collapsed into vast heaps that now offered better defensive positions than the exposed slopes beneath them. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, the commanding officer of the 14th Army Corps, recognized immediately what many Allied planners had failed to foresee. The ruins themselves had become a fortress within the fortress. The moral weight of destroying centuries of Christian heritage had fallen on the Allies alone. Germany's defenders would extract tactical advantage from that catastrophe, and they would use the ensuing pause to prepare for what they knew was coming. On the 15th of February, less than 3 days after the monastery ceased to exist, Allied commanders launched the second assault on Monte Cassino. This time, the weight would fall differently. The Americans had suffered enough. The New Zealand Corps, under General Bernard Freyberg, would lead the attack, supported by Indian divisions and British contingents. Air Marshal Arthur Harris had already positioned his bombers on the tarmac. The strategy was no longer subtle. Overwhelming force, administered without hesitation, would grind down the German positions through a campaign of sustained aerial bombardment, followed by mass infantry assault. The scale of the aerial campaign that preceded the second battle defied easy comprehension. Beginning in the early hours of the 15th of February, wave after wave of heavy bombers descended on the heights surrounding Monte Cassino. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilot training, could offer only token resistance. British and American fighters swept the skies clean. Below, the landscape trembled under the weight of falling ordnance. High explosive bombs, each capable of leveling entire buildings, rained down in carefully coordinated patterns. The bombardment continued for hours without interruption. German defenders cowered in their dugouts and fortified positions, pressing themselves against reinforced walls and praying that the next impact would not find them. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. Men could not think clearly under such assault. They could only endure. Communications broke down. Ammunition dumps were destroyed. Supply routes became impassable. When the bombing finally lifted, after releasing more tonnage than had been used in the entire North African campaign, the landscape around Monte Cassino resembled a moonscape. The ground itself seemed broken, cratered, and hostile to human life. Yet the German defenders emerged from their shelters to find their defensive lines largely intact. They had survived the bombardment. Now they would face the infantry. The attack began with darkness still covering the slopes. New Zealand troops, veterans of North Africa and the Pacific, moved up through the snow-covered terrain toward the lower positions. Behind them came Indian divisions, soldiers from the subcontinent fighting in an alien landscape under commanders speaking a language not their own. The cold was merciless. Snow lay thick on the ground, making movement difficult and slow. Every footfall crunched audibly in the frozen night, announcing the advance to watching German observers. The New Zealand sappers worked methodically to cut paths through the wire obstacles and clear mines from the forward slopes. Machine gun fire opened up from concealed positions as the New Zealanders came within range. The sound of combat echoed across the mountain, gunfire and grenades punctuating the darkness. Men fell on the snow, their blood spreading across the white surface in dark pools. The attackers pressed forward, despite casualties. They had been promised that the bombardment had destroyed German defences. They had seen the explosions light the sky. Surely the enemy positions must be shattered. Surely the mountain would fall quickly under such overwhelming pressure. But as they climbed higher, they discovered the terrible truth. The Germans had endured. Waffen SS units, dug deep into the mountain itself, emerged from blast shelters with weapons ready. Counterattacks followed swiftly. Squads of elite soldiers, trained in mountain warfare and close combat, charged down the slopes at the attackers. The fighting became confused and desperate in the darkness and snow. By dawn on the 16th of February, the battle had assumed a rhythm of assault and counter-assault. The New Zealanders had gained ground, but at enormous cost. The Indians, Many of them, inexperienced in such conditions, had suffered particularly heavy casualties. Wave after wave of fresh troops was fed into the battle throughout the day. Artillery pounded the German positions. Tank support was attempted but proved ineffective in the snow. The vehicles became bogged down on the slopes. One after another, they were immobilized and abandoned. The fighting devolved into a series of desperate close-quarters combats around bunkers and fortified positions. Soldiers fought with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and entrenching tools. Blood stained the snow. The screams of the wounded cut through the artillery fire. The mountain accepted no mercy and showed no preference for either side. For the New Zealand and Indian troops, the reality became increasingly apparent. Monte Cassino could not be taken through frontal assault alone, no matter how many men were sacrificed. The position was too strong. The defenders were too determined. The terrain favored the defense with an almost mathematical certainty. German machine gunners, positioned on the high ground, could rake advancing troops with interlocking fields of fire. Any attempt to assault directly up the slopes meant crossing ground with minimal cover and no concealment. The attackers suffered casualties at a rate that made the continuation of the offensive questionable. Yet the orders from higher command remained unchanged. Continue the assault, press the attack, break through the German line. The second day of fighting saw the bombardment renew with even greater intensity. Allied commanders had committed a further massive aerial campaign. Aircraft raced low over the mountain, strafing German positions with cannon fire. Artillery batteries, positioned miles behind the front, fired thousands of rounds in a single day. The noise became an almost physical force. Soldiers who survived the constant bombardment reported afterward that they could no longer hear properly for days. Their ears rang with a high-pitched whine that would not fade. The psychological pressure of such sustained attack was nearly as destructive as the physical effects. But the German defenders, many of them veterans of years of combat on the Russian front, understood how to survive bombardment. They remained in their positions. They husbanded their ammunition carefully. They maintained discipline. Officers and senior NCOs moved constantly through the positions, checking on their men, ensuring that weapons remained ready and that the perimeter held. There was an almost bureaucratic quality to German defense, systematic, methodical, and ultimately effective. Each position was documented on maps. Each machine gun had a precisely calculated field of fire. Each defensive line had pre-registered artillery targets. When the infantry attacks came, the Germans responded with the efficiency of a complex machine that had been maintained and serviced by generations of professional soldiers. The Indian divisions, less accustomed to such extreme conditions and the nature of mountain warfare, suffered more terribly than their New Zealand comrades. The cold itself became an enemy, almost as formidable as the German defenders. Frostbite claimed as many soldiers as bullets and bombs. Men collapsed from exposure even as they attempted to advance up the slopes. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. The Indian hospitals filled with casualties suffering from both combat wounds and severe hypothermia. Some soldiers sat in the snow, frozen almost in place, their hands and feet turning black with tissue death. The combination of cold, altitude, and combat created a nightmare environment that tested the limits of human endurance. Yet the Indian troops continued to attack. Order after order came down the chain of command. The Cassino position must fall. The Gustav Line must be broken. General Freyberg, commanding the New Zealand Corps, found himself trapped between the impossible demands of his superiors and the evident reality that his troops could not take the position through direct assault. He requested permission to change tactics, to attempt flanking movements, to find some alternative to the grinding frontal attack. His requests were refused. The orders were to continue assaulting the position, and so the men climbed the mountain again and again, day after day, returning to the same bloody ground where their comrades had fallen. By the 23rd of February, after more than a week of continuous fighting, the second battle had clearly failed to achieve a breakthrough. The New Zealand and Indian forces had suffered thousands of casualties. They had advanced in some sectors, but remained short of the monastery ruins and the high ground beyond. The German defenders, though depleted and exhausted, had held. In fact, they had done far more than hold. They had conducted a masterclass in defensive warfare under overwhelming pressure. General von Senger und Etterlin, observing the battle from his command post, recognized that his troops had passed the critical test. The Allies had committed massive resources, air power, artillery, infantry reserves, and logistical support on an unprecedented scale. And yet the German line had not broken. It had flexed under the pressure. It had bent in places, but it had not snapped. This realization steeled the resolve of German commanders. They understood now that they could not be defeated simply through the application of greater force. They could only be defeated if the Allies could achieve tactical surprise, or if German resources ran out entirely. The second option was becoming increasingly likely, but not yet inevitable. Von Senger ordered his commanders to prepare for the third assault. It would come. The Allies would not accept defeat at Monte Cassino. They would return, reorganize, and attack again, and the Germans would be waiting. The Waffen SS divisions committed to the defense of Monte Cassino during the second battle demonstrated the capabilities that had made them feared across Europe. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, though stripped of much of its armor, provided some of the most effective defensive troops on the mountain. SS officers, many of them experienced in the complex terrain warfare of the Russian front, applied those lessons to the Italian slopes. They understood how to create depth in defensive positions, how to layer defenses so that the destruction of one position did not compromise the integrity of the entire line. They understood how to use counterattacks not as wasteful commitments of strength, but as precise surgical strikes designed to destroy the enemy's cohesion and inflict disproportionate casualties. The SS soldiers, indoctrinated since childhood in ideological commitment and trained relentlessly in combat skills, were capable of fighting under conditions that would have broken ordinary soldiers. They possessed a fanaticism that transcended the rational calculation of cost and benefit. Surrender was not an option they considered. Withdrawal occurred only under direct orders and in controlled phases. The combination of training, ideology, and tactical skill made the Waffen SS formations extraordinarily effective defenders, particularly in positions like Monte Cassino, where terrain advantages could be fully exploited. The contrast between the two armies became starkly apparent as the second battle progressed. The Allies possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, air dominance, and material resources that seemed inexhaustible. They had reserves of men and ammunition that could absorb losses on an almost incomprehensible scale. And yet, facing a smaller, resource-starved enemy entrenched in a naturally formidable position, that material advantage had not translated into victory. The German defenders, numbering far fewer men but positioned on ground of their choosing, had imposed a bloody stalemate on their attackers. The second battle revealed a fundamental truth about warfare that would echo through the remainder of the Second World War. Material superiority alone could not guarantee tactical success. The defender, particularly if well positioned and well led, could impose penalties on the attacker that bordered on the unsustainable. The New Zealand and Indian troops fought with courage and determination that commanded respect. They advanced repeatedly into withering fire. They accepted casualties that would have broken lesser soldiers. But courage and determination could not overcome the mathematical reality of their situation. They were attacking uphill into prepared defensive positions held by expert defenders who fought with an intensity born of ideology and training. Something more would be needed to break the German line at Monte Cassino. Air power alone had proven insufficient. Artillery alone had proven insufficient. Infantry assault, no matter how numerically superior, had proven insufficient. The Allies would need to find a new approach, a new way to break the stalemate that had formed on the mountain. By the end of February, the second battle had wound down into a grinding attrition as both sides acknowledged the failure to achieve decisive results. German counterattacks had become less frequent as casualties mounted and replacements became scarcer. Allied offensives continued, but with less intensity, as commanders regrouped and reconsidered their approach. The snow began to melt, revealing the terrible world of combat: frozen corpses, destroyed equipment, torn barbed wire, and the detritus of failed assaults. Burial parties worked constantly to remove the dead before decomposition became an additional hazard. The Geneva Convention was observed, at least formally, with the dead of both sides receiving burial rites. Officers drafted casualty reports. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of men had been killed or wounded. The mountain had consumed them with an appetite that never seemed satisfied, and still the Gustav Line held. Still the Germans remained in their positions. Still the road to Rome remained blocked. The Second Battle of Monte Cassino had joined the first in the catalogue of failure. Neither the bombing of the monastery nor the massive assault that followed had broken German resistance. The Alpine defenders had proven that they could endure almost anything that the Allies could inflict upon them, at least in the short term. The question that now faced Allied commanders was profound and troubling. How many more battles would be required? How many more casualties would be acceptable? How many months would the mountain consume before it finally fell? No one knew the answer, and so the exhausted troops settled into their positions to wait for the next round of fighting, knowing that the mountain was not yet finished with them. By the opening week of March in 1944, the mountains around Cassino had begun to transform. Winter's grip remained unbroken across the high peaks, but the exhaustion of both armies was now visible in every calculation, every artillery preparation, every grimly determined advance up slopes that seemed to offer nothing but death. The Allies had launched 2 offensives already. Both had foundered. Both had cost thousands of lives, and yet, standing in their forward positions, looking up at the monastery and the ridges beyond it, commanders on both sides understood that the struggle was far from finished. If anything, it was entering its most brutal phase, a phase where mountains would be measured not in terrain gained, but in men consumed. The third offensive at Monte Cassino, known to the Allies as Operation Dickens, began on the 15th of March. It opened not with infantry assault but with what was then conceived as the ultimate expression of modern warfare, a massive aerial bombardment designed to obliterate German defensive positions entirely. 400 tons of bombs fell on the narrow mountain stronghold within the space of less than 2 hours. The earth convulsed. The monastery, already damaged by the February bombing, absorbed further punishment. The roads became canyons of broken stone. The German positions, methodically prepared across months of labor, were subjected to a violence that seemed, from behind Allied lines, absolutely annihilating. Commanders watched from lower elevations, expecting that when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, German resistance would have been pulverized into silence. What followed instead was something far more complicated and far more troubling. The bombardment had in fact destroyed much. But destruction on a mountainside is a paradoxical thing. the rubble itself became new defensive terrain. Tanks could not climb among shattered buildings and fractured rock. Infantry charging upward found themselves navigating a maze of obstacles that slowed their advance and funneled them toward waiting machine gun positions. The very violence meant to clear the way became, in the hands of disciplined defenders, an asset, and the defenders at Monte Cassino, under the command of officers who had learned their trade across years of desperate fighting in Russia and North Africa, understood how to make use of whatever the mountain provided. They had endured the bombardment in dugouts reinforced far beneath the surface. When the last bomb fell and the artillery barrage that followed finally ceased, German soldiers emerged from their shelters and took up positions amid the wreckage with a grim professionalism that spoke of men who had seen far worse and intended to see it through. The New Zealand 2nd Division advanced up the mountain in the aftermath of that bombardment, moving through the pulverized landscape with caution born from the knowledge that German defenses seldom yielded even when subjected to such punishment. Behind them came Indian forces, drawn from the Indian Army and representing a vast portion of the British Commonwealth's military reach. The terrain they crossed was almost lunar in its desolation. What had been paths became rubble fields. What had been buildings were now merely suggestions of structure, blackened and twisted. The snow that covered higher elevations made every movement visible, every advance telegraphed across the landscape. German machine gunners, dug into positions chosen months earlier and refined by countless rehearsals, waited with patience born from the knowledge that their task was not to win the battle outright, but to impose such costs that the Allies would eventually break. They succeeded. The advance up the lower slopes began with promise, but slowed progressively as losses mounted. By the evening of the 15th, significant ground had been taken. The Allies had established themselves higher on the mountain than ever before, but the summit remained in German hands, and every meter gained had cost blood. Artillery fire from both sides now became almost continuous. The Allies, possessing overwhelming superiority in guns and ammunition, poured shells onto the mountain with mechanical regularity. Harassment fire, designed to keep German defenders suppressed, to prevent them from consolidating, to grind them down through sheer volume. German artillery, fewer in number but expertly handled, responded with counter-battery fire and interdiction of approach routes. The effect was to transform the mountain itself into an instrument of warfare. The ground trembled constantly, rocks fell unpredictably from higher slopes. The air itself seemed to become toxic with the smell of explosive residue and burnt earth. In such conditions, soldiers on both sides moved in a state of suspended shock, aware that any moment might bring the detonation that would end them, unable to prevent it, and therefore locked in a strange mental state where resignation and determination became indistinguishable. By the 18th of March, 3 days into Operation Dickens, the momentum of the Allied advance had stalled entirely. The Allies had taken perhaps a third of the mountain's circumference and established themselves at higher elevations than the previous offensives had reached, but they were not advancing further. The German command, now coordinating a complex defense involving multiple divisions and a layered system of fallback positions, had executed what tacticians would later study as a masterpiece of elastic defense. As one position became untenable, German reserves flowed from reserve lines to plug gaps. As infantry assaults gained ground, counterattacks launched from prepared positions would force the Allies to consolidate and regroup rather than press forward. The mountain had become a grinding machine where both sides fed resources and men into its apex, hoping each time that the next bombardment, the next assault, the next counterattack would finally tip the balance. the Waffen SS formations defending Monte Cassino during this period, drawn from divisions that had seen combat across multiple European theatres, implemented tactical methods that demonstrated a level of sophistication often overlooked in conventional histories. Rather than attempting to hold every metre of ground in a rigid linear defence, German commanders created a system of mutually supporting strongpoints distributed across the slopes, with prepared fallback positions behind them. When the Allies attacked one strongpoint, defenders from neighbouring positions would deliver flanking fire. When that strongpoint became surrounded or overwhelmed, the garrison would withdraw to a prepared position behind it, where they would again establish a defended perimeter. This method meant that even in the face of superior numbers and firepower, German defenders could extract maximum casualties from attacking forces while maintaining organizational coherence. It also meant they could trade ground for time without experiencing the catastrophic collapse that often follows when a defensive line breaks. The weather throughout March remained bitterly cold at elevation. Snow covered the high slopes. Rain turned lower paths into rivers of mud. Soldiers on both sides suffered from conditions that were almost as lethal as enemy fire. Trench foot became endemic. Exposure claimed lives. Medical officers worked in tents heated only by small stoves, treating an endless procession of wounded men whose injuries ranged from bullet wounds and shrapnel lacerations to frostbite and pneumonia. Evacuation of the seriously wounded from the mountain became progressively more difficult as German artillery made lower approach routes increasingly hazardous. Many Allied soldiers died not from enemy action, but from a combination of cold, exhaustion, and inadequate medical care. The mountain, indifferent to ideology or nationality, had become an enemy to both armies. By late March, the three offensives had involved enormous numbers of troops and consumed staggering quantities of ammunition and resources. The Allies had suffered perhaps 45,000 casualties in their assaults on Monte Cassino across the preceding 8 weeks. German losses were comparable, and in some estimates higher, particularly among irreplaceable officers and non-commissioned officers whose experience and training could not be quickly replaced. And yet the fundamental strategic situation had hardly changed. The Allies controlled somewhat more of the mountain but not the commanding heights. The Germans had been pushed back but not broken. The winter line remained, albeit with its apex dented and weakened. The Gustav Line was still intact at its core. Rome remained unconquered. The road north remained blocked. The attrition warfare that characterized the March offensive revealed a fundamental dilemma of the Italian campaign. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in manpower and materiel when viewed at the theatre level, but at the tactical level, a well-trained and well-positioned defender could inflict such losses on attackers that the calculus became questionable. Every kilometre gained cost thousands of casualties. Every day of delay saw the Germans strengthening defences further north, preparing positions that the Allies would eventually have to assault as well. The Allies were winning in the sense of gaining ground and inflicting losses, but at such a rate that the whole enterprise began to seem profoundly inefficient. German commanders, meanwhile, understood that they were ultimately losing a battle of attrition. Their manpower reserves were finite. Their ability to replace losses was limited, but they also understood that if they could impose sufficient costs on the Allies, if they could delay long enough, strategic circumstances elsewhere might change. Ultimately, neither understanding was correct. The Allies would press on. The Germans would be forced to retreat. But for the moment, in March 1944, neither side could yet see how or when that end would arrive. By the end of March, Operation Dickens had ground to a halt, in much the same way the previous offensives had concluded. The Allies had made marginal territorial gains at catastrophic cost. German defences had been battered, but remained organised and functional. The third major offensive at Monte Cassino had failed in its objective to break through the Gustav Line and open the road to Rome. Allied commanders recognised that the assault tactics they had employed were not generating sufficient results. German defenders, exhausted and depleted but still unbowed, prepared for the inevitability of further attacks while consolidating the positions they still held. The mountain in March 1944 had become a mirror in which both armies saw something they did not want to acknowledge: that the war itself, in its brutal logic, had now entered a phase where victory would be measured only in the cumulative sacrifice of multitudes. By the time the second major assault on Monte Cassino began in late February 1944, the German defenders had moved beyond simple resistance into something far more sophisticated. What had emerged from the chaos and blood of the first offensive was a mature understanding of defensive warfare adapted to an age of aerial bombardment and overwhelming numerical superiority. The officers who commanded the Waffen SS units holding the mountain were not ideologues or fanatics screaming for glory. They were combat-hardened professionals who had seen the inside of armoured warfare on the Eastern Front, understood the limits of human endurance, and recognized that survival depended on doing more with less. Among them were men whose names would become almost forgotten, yet whose tactical innovations kept an increasingly desperate German position from collapsing under hammer blows that would have shattered less disciplined forces. The foundation of German defensive strategy at Monte Cassino rested on what military historians call elastic defense in depth. Rather than holding the mountain as a single rigid line, the commanders arranged their troops in a series of interconnected positions that allowed them to bend without breaking. The mountain itself became a layered fortress, with machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, and infantry positions arranged so that attacking troops could advance across one slope, only to encounter another prepared line just beyond the ridge. This was a brutal calculus. The Germans could not stop the Allies from advancing uphill, but they could ensure that every meter gained cost blood and more blood. The approach drew from lessons learned in Russia, where German defenders had discovered that static lines collapsed under sustained assault, while mobile, deep defences allowed a smaller force to inflict maximum casualties while withdrawing in controlled phases. The key to making elastic defense work was the counterattack. A frontal position, no matter how well prepared, becomes increasingly isolated and vulnerable as enemy troops push through gaps and around flanks. German commanders at Monte Cassino understood that the only answer to being outnumbered was to refuse to allow the enemy to establish superiority at any single point. When the Allies broke through one layer of defense, German reserves did not hesitate. Small assault groups, often consisting of no more than 2 or 3 dozen men, would launch immediate counterattacks designed not necessarily to drive the enemy back wholesale, but to restore the integrity of the defensive line. These counterattacks were coordinated with machine gun and mortar fire from neighbouring positions, creating crossfire that multiplied the effect of every defender. An Allied platoon that thought it had captured a position would suddenly find itself under fire from multiple directions and compelled to deal with German infantry charging into the rubble. The terrain itself became a weapon in the hands of commanders who understood how to use it. Monte Cassino's steep slopes, rocky outcroppings, and sparse vegetation meant that attacking troops had to traverse exposed ground under fire. Engineers working for the German defenders had constructed networks of trenches, bunkers, and communication trenches that threaded through the high ground like a nervous system. Barbed wire covered approaches, and fields of fire had been calculated with precision so that every accessible slope came under observation and machine gun coverage from at least 2 different positions. Mortars and artillery were registered on specific points on the mountain where assault columns would inevitably become compressed and vulnerable. When American or British or later Polish soldiers climbed toward the monastery, they were not advancing across open terrain, but threading through a 3-dimensional maze designed to funnel them into killing zones. What made this system genuinely innovative was how German commanders managed logistics and reserves in an environment where resupply and reinforcement were genuinely difficult. The road up Monte Cassino was a narrow track easily interdicted by artillery and air attack. No Wehrmacht unit at the mountain had the luxury of unlimited ammunition or the ability to simply rotate divisions in and out at will. Yet the German defense held because officers developed ruthless discipline about resource allocation. Every round of ammunition was accounted for. Every position manned only with the minimum necessary strength, while reserves were held back in locations that offered protection from air attack and artillery bombardment. When a particular sector came under assault, reserves were committed with precision, not to hold ground, but to restore the integrity of the defense and prevent the Allies from achieving breakthrough. This meant that German commanders were constantly making decisions about calculated withdrawal and tactical consolidation rather than fighting for every centimeter of ground. The concept of battle groups or task force organization also allowed German defenders to maintain flexibility despite being spread thinly across an enormous front. Rather than adhering rigidly to divisional or regimental boundaries, commanders assembled mixed units of infantry, machine gunners, engineers, and assault pioneers capable of functioning independently and responding rapidly to threats. A single battle group might include troops from multiple Waffen SS divisions, Wehrmacht mountain regiments, and specialist engineer units, all operating under a single commander responsible for a specific sector of the mountain. This organizational flexibility meant that when casualties mounted in one area or when a particular threat emerged elsewhere, reserves could be rapidly reorganized and redeployed without the bureaucratic delays that plagued more conventional military hierarchies. The Waffen SS in particular, having operated as a more mobile and less tradition-bound force than the Wehrmacht, proved particularly adept at this kind of ad hoc organization. Artillery played a role that was sometimes overlooked in narratives focused on the infantry fighting. German gunners, firing from positions in the valleys and ridges behind Monte Cassino, maintained a web of interdicting fire that made any Allied movement risky and any concentration of forces genuinely suicidal. These artillerymen coordinated their fire with forward observers positioned on the mountain, allowing them to place shells on target with remarkable speed when assault troops tried to consolidate gains or when supply columns attempted to resupply forward positions. German mortar crews, working at battalion and company level throughout the defensive positions on the mountain itself, provided intimate fire support that could reach areas inaccessible to larger guns. The Germans also made devastating use of machine guns, not merely as direct fire weapons, but as suppressing fire that forced attacking infantry to seek cover and disrupt their assault momentum. An Allied soldier climbing Monte Cassino was caught not only in a physical battle against the mountain and the defenders, but in a storm of projectiles orchestrated with precision and discipline. The role of individual commanders in sustaining this defensive system cannot be overstated. These were officers who had seen years of combat and understood the psychology of battle as well as the mechanics. They knew that even the best defensive system would collapse if the men manning it lost confidence. They led by example, moving between positions to assess conditions, make decisions, and demonstrate by their presence that the command structure had not abandoned the men in the line. When American assaults broke through initial defenses in January 1944, it was the calm leadership of these officers that prevented German troops from falling back in panic. Instead, men consolidated on the next prepared position, counterattacked to restore the line, and maintained discipline even when the noise and chaos of battle might have induced terror. These leaders also understood that their soldiers were not the fanatical ideology-driven troops of propaganda, but men exhausted by years of war, terrified of being killed or wounded, and held in place by unit cohesion, trust in leadership, and the knowledge that abandoning positions would result in execution by politically appointed officers. Logistical innovation was equally crucial to the German defense. Supply lines to Monte Cassino ran through territory that Allied air forces dominated completely during daylight hours. Convoys that moved during the day were slaughtered from the air. German supply officers therefore reorganized their entire logistical system to operate under cover of darkness. Trucks moved at night. Supplies were cached in positions hidden from aerial observation, and water was collected from mountain springs rather than transported up long and vulnerable routes. Men learned to survive with minimal food and ammunition, accepting hunger and discomfort as the price of avoiding the destruction that would result from predictable supply patterns. Ammunition was distributed at the lowest possible level to avoid wasteful expenditure. Captured Italian and even American supplies were incorporated into German use. Medical supplies were improvised from whatever could be scavenged or manufactured locally. This was not just military adaptation, but a form of tactical sophistication that went beyond what infantry manuals prescribed. The question of morale and ideological motivation deserves careful examination because it separates propaganda from reality. Popular narratives sometimes depict Waffen SS soldiers as fanatics driven by Nazi ideology to fight to the death regardless of tactical reality. The evidence from Monte Cassino suggests something more complex. These men were undoubtedly volunteers in a way that regular Wehrmacht conscripts were not, and many had joined the Waffen SS partly for ideological reasons. But at Monte Cassino, what kept them fighting was not primarily abstract ideology, but unit cohesion, leadership, tactical success, and the simple fact that they held strong ground against attackers who had to come to them. Men who are defending fortified positions under prepared defenses often resist with greater determination than those attacking exposed ground. The officers and non-commissioned officers who led these units deliberately cultivated the sense that their defensive system actually worked, that the enemy was suffering enormous casualties for negligible gains, and that continued resistance served a purpose beyond mere fanaticism. The evolution of Waffen SS tactical doctrine at Monte Cassino also reflected broader German military thinking about how to fight a two-front war while materially outmatched. The Waffen SS had access to some of the newest German equipment, including assault rifles, hand grenades, and anti-tank weapons that gave individual soldiers greater combat capability than their Allied counterparts. German officers trained their men to use terrain, concentrated firepower, and local coordination rather than relying on massed formations and numerical superiority. When a German soldier climbed into a defensive position on Monte Cassino, he was given not just a rifle, but a role in a sophisticated system designed to give him maximum effectiveness, despite the overall German numerical disadvantage. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers circulated among the troops constantly, teaching, correcting, and above all maintaining the mental state necessary for sustained resistance. By the time Operation Diadem began in May 1944, the German defenders had refined their tactical system to a level approaching perfection, given the constraints they operated under. The question was never whether such a system could stop the Allies indefinitely. With air superiority, numerical superiority, and unlimited ammunition and supplies, the Allies could eventually overwhelm any fixed defense. But what the Waffen SS commanders had achieved was to transform Monte Cassino from a position that might have fallen in a matter of days into a strong point that took months to capture at an enormous cost. They had turned tactical limitations into strengths through professional military expertise. In doing so, they demonstrated that even in the context of Nazi Germany's increasingly desperate strategic position, individual units containing capable officers could still fight with discipline and sophistication rather than mere fanaticism. The mountain held not because of ideology, but because of tactics, leadership, and the professional competence of men who understood that their duty was to their soldiers and to effective military defense, whatever larger questions surrounded the cause they were fighting for. By the spring of 1944, the stalemate at Monte Cassino had become intolerable to Allied command. 3 major offensives had been launched, in January, February, and March, and each had ended in tactical failure, despite enormous expenditure of lives and material. The mountain remained in German hands. The monastery lay in ruins, a monument to futility. Winter was giving way to spring, and the weather that had so brutally hampered operations in the previous months was finally turning in the Allies' favor. Yet something more than improved conditions was needed to break the deadlock. What was required was a comprehensive reassessment of strategy, a fundamental gathering of strength that would dwarf all previous efforts, and a new coalition of nations willing to shed blood for a single objective. This would become Operation Diadem, not merely another assault on a mountain, but the largest unified offensive yet attempted on the Italian peninsula, a multinational endeavor that would bring together the fighting power of 5 nations in an orchestrated attempt to shatter German defenses once and for all. The strategic situation in the spring of 1944 was becoming increasingly urgent for the Allies. The German winter line still barred the road to Rome. German forces continued to resist with a determination that suggested they might hold indefinitely. Meanwhile, across the Channel, planning was well advanced for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy scheduled for early June. Resources that might have been devoted to Italy were being stockpiled and positioned for the cross-Channel assault. There was a genuine fear among Allied commanders that if Monte Cassino could not be broken before the Normandy landings, Italy would become a secondary theatre, with resources diverted northward and German forces allowed to withdraw at their leisure to stronger positions further north. The window of opportunity was closing. Command decisions had been made, and they were decisive ones. A new overall commander, British General Harold Alexander, had taken charge of operations in Italy and brought fresh strategic vision to the campaign. He understood that the breakthrough at Monte Cassino could not be achieved through repeated frontal assaults up exposed slopes. What was needed was maneuver, coordination, concentration of force at decisive points, and the deployment of forces in such overwhelming numbers that German reserves could not be stretched to meet every threat simultaneously. The plan would be called Operation Diadem, and it would be an undertaking on an entirely different scale from anything previously attempted. The logistical preparations for Operation Diadem were immense and required months of careful coordination. Divisions from multiple nations had to be brought together, supplied, equipped, and positioned without alerting German intelligence to the full scope of the coming assault. American forces from the Fifth Army were reinforced and reorganized. British and Canadian divisions moved into position. Ammunition dumps were established throughout the rear areas. Engineering units prepared bridging equipment and supplies for the inevitable infrastructure damage that would result from heavy combat. Artillery batteries, hundreds of them, were positioned to deliver the concentrated bombardment that would precede the assault. The sheer volume of material and personnel that had to be marshaled was staggering, yet it was accomplished with the kind of industrial efficiency that had become characteristic of the Allied war effort by 1944. The German army, watching from their fortified positions, could sense the gathering storm. Reconnaissance reports spoke of increasing troop concentrations, larger supply convoys, more frequent air operations. Yet even German command could not know the precise scope of what was coming. They faced decisions about where to allocate their limited reserves, how to distribute their forces along hundreds of kilometers of front, and how much strength to concentrate at Monte Cassino itself. But the true innovation of Operation Diadem lay not merely in its scale, but in its character as a genuinely multinational enterprise. The operation would bring together not just Americans and British, but also Canadian forces, French divisions, and, most significantly for the symbolic power of the coming assault, the Polish army. Each of these nations brought their own tactical doctrines, command structures, and national motivations to the fight. The Americans would press from the west and southwest. The British would attack along different axes. The Canadians would advance in their own sectors. The French, eager to restore their reputation after the humiliation of 1940, would commit divisions under their own commanders. And the Poles would come to Monte Cassino with a purpose that transcended mere military calculation. For the Polish soldiers, Monte Cassino represented something that could not be measured in purely strategic terms. Poland itself had been erased from the map of Europe, partitioned between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. The Polish nation had no independent government recognized by most of the world. Polish soldiers who fought for the Allies were fighting for a homeland that technically did not exist, for a government that was in exile, and for a national cause that seemed increasingly desperate as Soviet armies moved westward and Western leaders negotiated with Stalin. Monte Cassino became, in the minds of these soldiers, a place where Polish courage and sacrifice could be demonstrated, where honor could be reclaimed, and where the world might bear witness to Polish determination to reclaim their place among nations. The Polish contingent assigned to Operation Diadem was the 2nd Polish Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders. Anders was a professional soldier of the old Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army, a man shaped by the traditions of 19th-century European military professionalism. He had fought in the First World War, and then in wars, to defend the newly independent Poland. When Poland fell to Nazi invasion in 1939, he was captured and imprisoned. He remained in captivity until the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1941, when the Soviet Union, now at war with Germany, released him as part of a pragmatic agreement to allow Polish soldiers to continue the fight against the common enemy. Anders had then led Polish forces in the Soviet Union and the Middle East, and now, in the spring of 1944, he commanded approximately 50,000 Polish soldiers, many of them hardened by years of warfare and loss. These were men who had seen their country disappear, their families scattered or killed, and themselves forced to wander distant lands in pursuit of a victory that might allow them to return home. For these soldiers, Monte Cassino held profound meaning. The monastery itself, ancient and venerable, represented the continuity of European civilization, something that Poland felt it was fighting to preserve. The mountain became a symbol of national resistance, of refusing to accept defeat, of the determination to carve out a place in history despite overwhelming adversity. The intelligence picture that Operation Diadem commanders developed in the weeks preceding the assault was increasingly detailed and sophisticated. Air reconnaissance provided photographs showing German defensive positions, artillery emplacements, and troop movements. Prisoners of war and deserters provided information about German morale, unit strengths, and command decisions. Ultra-intercepts, the classified intelligence derived from decrypted German radio communications, revealed the disposition of German reserves and the constraints under which German command operated. What emerged was a picture of formidable German defences that were nonetheless stretched to their limits. German reserves were being drawn off to other sectors. The Waffen SS units at Monte Cassino, while professional and determined, were not receiving the level of reinforcement they might have hoped for. German command was aware that a major attack was coming, but the sheer scale of the Allied build-up, the multiple axes of assault that were being planned, and the uncertainty about where the main effort would fall, all worked to German disadvantage. The Germans would have to defend everywhere along a wide front with insufficient resources. Meanwhile, the Allies could concentrate overwhelming force at chosen points of attack. This was the classical advantage of the offensive over the defensive, multiplied by the industrial and logistical capacity of the Allied coalition. The coordination required to bring together forces from 5 different nations, each with their own command structures, their own doctrines, and their own political interests, was extraordinarily complex. General Harold Alexander served as the overall commander, providing strategic direction and coordination. British commanders oversaw certain sectors. American commanders directed American forces. The Poles operated semi-autonomously under General Anders, though they were integrated into the broader campaign plan. The French had their own commander and their own division of the battlefield. Liaison officers moved between headquarters, ensuring that each national contingent understood the role it was expected to play and that the overall offensive unfolded in a coordinated fashion. This was genuinely difficult work, for national pride was at stake, and each nation's military leadership wanted to ensure that their forces played a significant role and received credit for successes. Yet despite these tensions, the coordination held. Maps were exchanged. Fire plans were coordinated to ensure that artillery from different nations did not fall on each other's forces. Timetables were synchronized so that assaults would begin according to a coherent plan rather than a chaotic mass of uncoordinated attacks. By May, everything was in place. The Poles, in particular, had been positioned with a specific purpose in mind. General Alexander and his staff had decided that the assault on the monastery heights, the most symbolically significant objective on the mountain, would fall to the Polish corps. This was deliberate recognition of the particular significance that Monte Cassino held for Poland. It was also, frankly, a sound military decision, for the Poles were veteran soldiers, well-trained, motivated by more than mere military orders, and capable of sustaining the intensity of combat that would be required to capture the monastery position. The Polish soldiers understood the mission that had been given to them. They knew that they would be assaulting fortified positions held by well-trained German defenders. They knew that casualties would be heavy, yet they also understood that Monte Cassino, for them, represented something that transcended the tactical situation. It represented the possibility of demonstrating to the world that Poland, despite its military defeat, despite its occupation, despite the seeming inevitability of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, still possessed soldiers worthy of respect, soldiers capable of acts of courage and sacrifice that would be remembered in history. The weight of this understanding, The burden of being asked to perform not merely a military task but a symbolic one would weigh heavily on the Polish soldiers in the days ahead. The build-up to Operation Diadem also involved intensive preparation of the battlefield itself. Engineers conducted careful reconnaissance of assault routes. Officers led their men over the ground multiple times, pointing out objectives, identifying likely positions of German machine gun nests and mortar teams, and discussing tactics for dealing with specific defensive obstacles. Artillery officers calibrated their guns and conducted targeting exercises to ensure that their shells would land with precision when the barrage began. Tank crews serviced their vehicles and rehearsed coordinated movements with the infantry. Supply lines were tested and reorganized to ensure that ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies would flow smoothly forward once the assault began. Troop commanders held briefing after briefing, explaining to their men what was expected, what the objective was, and why the sacrifice they were being asked to make was necessary. For soldiers on both sides, this period immediately before a major operation is one of peculiar intensity. There is the knowledge of what is coming. There is the final preparation, both physical and psychological, for the ordeal ahead. There is the writing of last letters home, the quiet conversations with comrades about whether one will survive the coming battle, and the attempt to come to terms with the distinct possibility of death or serious injury. The German command, observing these preparations, continued to grapple with the fundamental problem of an outnumbered defense. German reinforcements arrived, additional Waffen SS units, mountain troops from other sectors, Wehrmacht artillery battalions. However, these reinforcements could not alter the essential situation. The Allies were gathering overwhelming strength. They would attack along multiple axes. German forces, spread across a 100-kilometer front, could not be strong everywhere. Gaps would inevitably open. German reserves, once committed, could not be easily shifted to meet new threats. The commander responsible for the sector around Monte Cassino understood this. He reinforced his defenses as best he could. He positioned his reserves carefully, trying to anticipate where the main Allied thrust would come. He coordinated with adjoining units to ensure that his flanks were not exposed. Yet even as these preparations proceeded, there was a fatalistic quality to German discussions. The soldiers understood that they faced the best equipped, most numerous, and most determined enemy they had encountered since the beginning of the war. Resistance was not only possible but necessary to delay the Allies, to inflict maximum casualties, to preserve German forces for operations elsewhere. But there was little expectation among German command that Monte Cassino could be held indefinitely against an assault of this magnitude. As May 1944 dawned, both sides sensed the imminence of the final struggle for Monte Cassino. The Allies had gathered their forces. The Poles had moved into their assault positions, ready to attack the monastery heights. The Americans, British, Canadians, and French were positioned along the front, prepared to attack on cue. The German defenders, numbering perhaps 100,000 soldiers across the entire winter line, but fewer in the immediate Monte Cassino sector, stood to their posts. Artillery units on both sides loaded their guns. Ammunition was brought forward. Water and rations were distributed. In the clear spring weather of May, both sides prepared themselves for what everyone understood would be a decisive moment in the Italian campaign. The long stalemate was about to end. The grinding, brutal, attritional struggle that had characterized the 3 previous assaults on Monte Cassino was about to give way to something far more violent and intense. A climactic assault that would involve more firepower, more soldiers, and more determination than anything that had yet been attempted on that accursed mountain. The multinational character of the coming offensive spoke to something fundamental about the Second World War, that it was a genuine coalition war, in which different nations with different political systems and different historical experiences had found common cause against fascism. It was an alliance forged by desperation and maintained through sheer force of will. Operation Diadem would test that alliance in ways that nothing yet had done. The Polish soldiers, in particular, carried with them the hopes and prayers of a nation that no longer existed as a political entity, but that lived on in the hearts of those who wore its uniform. They had endured decades of warfare, exile, and uncertainty about whether their homeland would ever be free again. Now they had been given the opportunity to plant their flag on a mountain that would become a symbol of Polish courage and sacrifice. General Władysław Anders, preparing his men for what was coming, spoke to them in terms that appealed not to military duty alone, but to national pride, to honor, and to the possibility that their sacrifice at Monte Cassino might be remembered in history as an act of defiant courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. The monastery, perched on the summit of the mountain, its rubble still visible from the bombing of February, would be the objective that would focus world attention. If the Poles could take it, if they could plant their flag on those heights, it would be a message to the world that Poland had not been defeated, that Polish soldiers were worthy of respect, and that Polish history was not yet finished. These were the themes that animated the Polish contingent as Operation Diadem. The 4th of May 1944 arrived with the weight of inevitability. Across the mountains south of Monte Cassino, more than 200,000 Allied soldiers from 15 nations prepared to launch what would be the largest coordinated assault on German positions since the campaign began. Operation Diadem, as it was codenamed, represented something unprecedented in scale and multinational cooperation. American, British, Canadian, French, Polish, New Zealand, South African, Indian, and other contingents had been coordinated into a unified force under British command. The Germans holding the Gustav Line knew what was coming. Intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and simple observation of massing troops and equipment made it clear that this would be no routine attack. What they could not know with certainty was the exact moment it would begin, or whether they could hold. The bombardment commenced in the early hours of the 11th of May. Artillery along the entire front, from the Tyrrhenian coast to the Adriatic, opened fire simultaneously in what seemed like a single, enormous explosion that shook the earth across a front stretching more than 90 kilometers. Guns by the thousands, field artillery, medium artillery, heavy artillery, poured shells into German positions with a rhythm and intensity that dwarfed everything that had come before. German troops in the trenches and bunkers described it as the end of the world. Men who had survived the Russian front, who had endured countless bombardments, spoke of this as qualitatively different from anything in their experience. The very mountains seemed to shake. Dust rose so thickly that visibility dropped to mere meters. The noise, soldiers reported, became a kind of physical force that pressed down on consciousness, that made thought itself difficult. For more than 3 hours, this continued without pause. Supply lines were severed, communication cables were cut. German reserve positions were hammered before the men crouching in them could even understand what was happening. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the bombardment shifted. The artillery fire lifted northward, creeping up the slopes toward the higher German positions and Monte Cassino itself. This was the signal. Across the front, Allied infantry rose from their positions and began moving forward. The French First Army attacked toward the Urunzi Mountains on the western flank. American forces pushed up toward the high ground. British and Canadian troops advanced toward the center, and on the eastern side, the Polish Second Corps moved into positions for their assault on the monastery heights themselves. The Germans, emerging from their bunkers into the choking dust and smoke, manned their remaining positions and began to fight. Machine guns chattered. Anti-tank guns fired. Mortars sent their shells arcing through the brown haze. German soldiers had trained for this scenario countless times. They understood that elastic defense meant trading space for time, that they should fall back to successive positions rather than be surrounded and destroyed in place. But knowing the theory and executing it under such overwhelming pressure were two different things. Men fought in confusion. Units lost contact with each other. Officers struggled to maintain order and coordinate movements across a battlefield where visibility was measured in tens of meters. The Polish contingent held particular significance in this phase of the fighting. The Polish Second Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders, had fought across North Africa and Sicily before arriving in Italy. For these soldiers, Monte Cassino represented something beyond mere military objective. The monastery had become a symbol, not just of German military strength, but of Polish determination to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation. The Poles harbored no illusions about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. They understood that this war, even if won, would not restore Polish independence as they knew it. But in Monte Cassino, they saw an opportunity to demonstrate Polish courage, Polish sacrifice, and Polish commitment to the Allied cause. The determination was almost palpable. As the bombardment lifted, Polish troops began their assault on the monastery approaches. They moved through the rubble of the monastery that had been destroyed by bombing months earlier, through terrain that had been further cratered by artillery and aerial bombs. They climbed slopes that offered almost no cover. German positions above them were prepared, pre-sighted, and manned by troops who had been given explicit orders to hold at all costs. What followed in the days after the initial assault was a succession of small unit actions that individually might seem minor, but collectively added up to a grinding campaign of attrition. The Poles would attack a position. German defenders would hold, inflicting heavy casualties. As Polish numbers mounted, the Germans would fall back to prepared secondary positions. Then the assault would begin again. Artillery support was crucial. Both sides relied on it to break attacks and suppress enemy fire. But at a certain point, when units were engaged at close quarters, artillery became impossible to use safely. Then combat became a matter of rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Soldiers charging uphill through the remnants of the monastery walls encountered German machine gunners firing point blank. Grenades were hurled back and forth across rubble heaps. German counterattacks, coordinated by officers and non-commissioned officers who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find intact communication channels, would drive Polish forces back down the slopes. Then Polish reinforcements would arrive, and the assault would resume. This pattern repeated itself over several days. Neither side seemed capable of delivering a knockout blow, yet the casualty lists on both sides continued to lengthen. German soldiers at this point in the campaign were operating under conditions of extreme strain. Many of the elite Waffen SS formations holding the heights of Monte Cassino had already endured 3 previous major offensives. They had repelled assaults from American, British, New Zealand, Indian, French, and Polish forces. They had suffered casualties that, while replaced with reinforcements, still meant that most units were operating at reduced strength, with personnel who had limited time to adjust to the terrain or the tactical situation. Supply lines had been disrupted by bombing and by the constant pressure of artillery fire. Ammunition was rationed more severely than before. Food was limited. Sleep was nearly impossible. German medical personnel were overwhelmed with wounded men who could not be evacuated due to the intensity of fighting and the lack of secure routes down the mountain. Shock and exhaustion became psychological facts of existence. Officers faced decisions that had no good solutions. They could order men to fight to the last bullet and die in place, or they could authorize tactical withdrawals that traded space for the preservation of combat capability. Most chose withdrawal, but even this became progressively more difficult as the perimeter contracted. The critical factor in German calculations was the realization, which became increasingly unavoidable over the 4th, 5th, and 6th days of May, that the position could not be held indefinitely. German High Command understood this. Field commanders understood this. Individual soldiers began to understand this as well. Unlike earlier in the war, when German troops fought with the conviction that they were fighting for German victory, these men were fighting for something more modest: the orderly withdrawal of their units, the preservation of enough combat capability to establish a new defensive line further north, and simply the hope of surviving another day. This shift in consciousness, subtle though it may have been, affected morale and the will to resist. Men began to ask themselves whether holding Monte Cassino for another day was worth their lives. Officers began to consider seriously where the next fallback position should be established. German engineers, working under fire, began preparing the Pisa-Rimini line further north, a series of positions that would become the next defensive barrier if the Gustav Line broke. The situation for the Allies, meanwhile, was one of massive superiority, constrained by the need to actually dislodge German troops from prepared defensive positions. The numerical advantage in troops, the overwhelming air superiority. German aircraft were now virtually absent from Italian skies, and the material advantage in artillery and ammunition meant that, mathematically, the outcome was not in doubt. But mathematics did not account for the topography. It did not account for German defensive skill. It did not account for the fact that the last person to hold a ridge often determines who captures it, and that this last person must be removed one by one through direct combat, often hand to hand. Polish attacks on the 18th of May, following days of fighting, finally began to break through German positions. Not because Germans chose to surrender, or because they had run out of ammunition, but because the successive waves of assault, the artillery support, and the sheer persistence of Polish soldiers began to overcome the geometric disadvantage of defending high ground against an assault from below. German positions that had held for days began to collapse. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but in critical locations where the intensity of assault had become simply overwhelming. The moment when German commanders finally gave the order to withdraw from the monastery heights came in the afternoon hours of the 18th of May. The decision had been anticipated, prepared for, and was executed with the kind of discipline that characterized German operations throughout the campaign. Rearguard elements, frequently composed of Waffen SS personnel, took up positions at successive fallback points, while the main body of troops moved down the mountain. These rearguards held long enough for reinforcing units to establish new positions, then withdrew in turn. It was not a panicked retreat. It was not a rout. It was instead a controlled, methodical withdrawal by troops who had been trained to execute exactly this kind of operation. But it was withdrawal nonetheless. The castle of Monte Cassino, or what remained of it, was secured by Polish troops who had paid an enormous price to reach it. The monastery rubble passed into Allied hands. The symbol that had sustained German defense and Polish determination had changed hands. That symbolic shift mattered, even if the military situation was far from over. German losses in the final assault phase were severe. Killed, wounded, missing, and captured numbered in the thousands across the entire front, though precise figures remain disputed by historians. Polish casualties were equally staggering. The Polish Second Corps suffered nearly 4,000 casualties in the assault on the monastery alone. British and American losses in their respective sectors were comparable. The scale of human cost required to advance a few kilometers over mountainous terrain stunned observers, even those seasoned by years of warfare. For every meter of ground captured, it seemed, the Allies paid in blood. For every position held and then abandoned, the Germans paid in blood. The mathematics of attrition worked in the Allies' favor simply because they had more soldiers to spare, more ammunition to expend, more resources to commit. But from the perspective of individual soldiers, whether Polish, German, British, or American, the cost seemed incomprehensible. Men who had survived previous assaults were killed in the final days. Officers who had held the line since January found themselves ordering retreat. Soldiers who had believed in the ultimate victory of Germany watched it receding further with each withdrawal. Yet the breakthrough, once achieved, became irreversible. As German forces withdrew from the monastery heights and began to fall back toward new defensive positions in the Liri Valley, the integrity of the Gustav Line as a coordinated position began to unravel. The French, attacking in the mountains to the west, began to push through gaps in German defenses. American forces, pressing forward in the center, found that resistance was becoming less coordinated, that German units were increasingly focused on disengagement rather than counterattack. The German strategic situation in the Monte Cassino sector transformed within hours from a defensive holding action to a fighting retreat. The question was no longer whether the Allies would capture the mountain, but how far north the German forces could withdraw while maintaining the ability to resist. The answer, increasingly, became not very far at all. German commanders were discovering what their equivalents on other fronts had already learned, that once a defensive line has been breached and the enemy has committed overwhelming force to exploitation, the next defensive line becomes the critical position. But there was no next line fully prepared. There were no reserves positioned to counterattack. There was only the continuing withdrawal northward, the establishment of hastily constructed positions, and the grim knowledge that German forces in Italy would never again hold such a comprehensively prepared position as the Gustav Line. For the soldiers involved, on both sides, the Fourth Battle of Monte Cassino represented a threshold moment. For the Allies, it was the promise that the seemingly immobile campaign in Italy was finally going to move. For the Germans, it was the confirmation that their ability to defend the peninsula was no longer a matter of skill and determination alone, but was fundamentally limited by the sheer imbalance of resources. The mountain that had defined the campaign for months was passing out of German hands. The symbols and the strategic realities were aligning. Rome lay beyond the Liri Valley. The road northward was beginning to open, and in the rubble of the monastery and the torn slopes of Monte Cassino, an entire phase of the Italian campaign was coming to an end. By the middle of May 1944, the mountain had become unsustainable. The German command knew this truth before the final assault began. Yet they held on with the grim determination of men who understood that every hour won at Monte Cassino was an hour gained for the retreat that must follow. The Polish divisions massed for what everyone understood would be the conclusive attack. American and British forces pressed from the western slopes. French colonial troops, having fought their way through the foothills with ferocious energy, now turned their weight against the crumbling German positions. The German defenders, by contrast, were exhausted. Their supplies dwindled. Reinforcements could no longer reach them in sufficient numbers. What had been an impregnable fortress in January had become a mousetrap by May, and the mice knew it. The final offensive erupted with overwhelming force. On the 18th of May, Polish and Canadian forces launched simultaneous assaults against the monastery ruins and the surrounding heights. The bombardment that preceded them exceeded anything yet launched on the mountain, artillery fire so intense that the earth itself seemed to convulse beneath the weight of explosives. German defenders huddled in their bunkers and trenches, protected but imprisoned, unable to move, unable to rest, waiting for the storm to pass so they could emerge and fight one more time. The line was no longer a line, but a series of disconnected strongpoints held by commanders who fought because they could do nothing else. The retreat had not yet been authorized, but the necessity of it hung over everything like smoke. The Polish assaults represented something more than a tactical operation. For the Polish soldiers fighting on that mountain, Monte Cassino had become a symbol that transcended geography. They had entered Italy as part of a British army, but they fought as Poles, and they fought with an intensity born from the knowledge that their nation had been wiped from the map by the very enemy they now faced. The monastery itself had been reduced to rubble weeks earlier by Allied bombing, but its height remained. That height was what mattered. The Polish regiments advanced up the slopes with a determination that German defenders recognized and respected, even as they cut down wave after wave of attacking infantry. The losses were fearsome. Yet the Poles came on, and the Germans, outnumbered and exhausted, began to yield ground in carefully controlled movements. The Waffen SS units holding the northern and central sectors of the mountain faced particular pressure because they occupied the highest ground and the most strategically critical positions. These were not conscripted soldiers fighting for a lost cause. These were volunteers, men who had chosen to join the elite formations of the regime, and their training and leadership remained superior to nearly everything the Allies possessed. But superiority of training cannot overcome overwhelming numbers indefinitely. By the 18th and 19th of May, German commanders made the agonizing decision that the position was no longer defensible, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because to remain would mean annihilation. The decision to withdraw represented not failure, but military realism, the recognition that a unit destroyed in place is worth less than a unit that can fight again. The withdrawal itself became a masterclass in military discipline under extreme pressure. German and Waffen SS rearguards were designated to hold specific terrain for as long as possible, while the main defensive line fell back to prearranged positions. These rearguards knew they might become isolated. They knew that rapid Allied advance could cut off their retreat. Yet they held their ground with the cool professionalism that had come to characterize the best German soldiers. Machine gun crews maintained their positions until the last moment, pouring fire into advancing infantry, then destroying their weapons and falling back in small groups to the next defensive line. Anti-tank guns fired until they too had to be abandoned or destroyed. Officers moved among their men, directing the withdrawal with precision, ensuring that units did not fragment into panicked flight, but instead retreated in cohesive formations. The Liri Valley opened before the Allies as the German defensive line cracked. This was the prize that had been fought for across 5 months of grinding combat. The valley offered open ground, terrain suitable for mechanized warfare, a path northward toward Rome that did not require attacking fortified mountains. German commanders understood that once the Gustav Line was definitively broken, the entire winter line system would become untenable. Secondary positions existed further north, but they would require reorganization and resupply. The Germans did not have time for either. The retreat accelerated into a race against the advancing Allied spearheads, a desperate effort to establish new defensive lines before the Allies could bring their full mechanized strength to bear. The human cost of the withdrawal mounted with each passing hour. German soldiers who had held their positions with extraordinary courage now had to make dangerous movements through areas under constant bombardment and air attack. Allied fighter bombers roamed the skies above the valley, pouncing on any concentration of troops or vehicles. The roads themselves became killing grounds. A column of German trucks attempting to move supplies northward might be spotted by a reconnaissance aircraft, and within minutes they would be attacked by waves of Spitfires or Thunderbolts. The Waffen SS units, by virtue of their discipline and organization, suffered fewer losses during the retreat than might have been expected, but losses mounted nonetheless. Men who had survived the mountain died on the roads heading away from it. The broader German position in Italy was collapsing in the wake of Monte Cassino's fall. The Allies could now move forces into the Liri Valley and up the coast, turning the positions that the Germans held elsewhere along the Gustav Line. The 10th Army, commanded by General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, faced the dire prospect of his entire defensive position becoming outflanked. German commanders made the decision to conduct a general withdrawal northward. This was no panic-stricken rout, but a carefully orchestrated military operation designed to preserve fighting strength for the battles that must inevitably come. However, such operations rarely proceed without significant losses, and the chaotic conditions following the breakthrough ensured that some German units would suffer far more than others. The Waffen SS formations in the sector conducted their withdrawal with particular attention to unit cohesion. The Nazi regime's elite formations had been indoctrinated with an ideology that emphasized willpower and determination overcoming obstacles. This ideology was useless in the face of overwhelming force and mathematical impossibility, but what remained useful was the training and organization that the Waffen SS maintained even in defeat. Officers and non-commissioned officers ensured that companies and battalions withdrew as units, not as scattered individuals. Supply elements were accounted for. The wounded were transported as far as circumstances allowed. Discipline held even in retreat, and discipline was what prevented the withdrawal from becoming a catastrophe. By the 23rd of May, the German defenders had abandoned the summit of Monte Cassino. Polish soldiers climbed the final slopes and raised their flag over the monastery ruins, a symbolic victory that transcended the tactical realities of the moment. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. German forces reorganized further north along new defensive lines. These positions would be fought over in the weeks and months that followed. The Waffen SS units that had defended Monte Cassino would fight again, bleed again, and eventually be driven further north toward the Gothic Line and beyond. But for now, in mid-May 1944, the focus was on establishing a new line and preventing the Allies from achieving a complete breakthrough. The losses sustained by both sides during the final battles defied comprehension. Polish regiments that had marched to the assault with full strength were decimated. American units that had supported the Polish advance counted their casualties with growing despair. German and Waffen SS defenders, who had held the mountain through 4 major offensives, suffered losses that could not easily be replaced. The mountain itself bore testimony to the violence. Every slope scarred by bombardment, every bunker reduced to rubble, the monastery reduced to scattered stones and ash. When the fighting ceased, when the German troops had finally withdrawn beyond pursuit, the mountain stood silent. The wind moved across the barren heights, carrying no sound except the occasional crack of settling rubble. What remained after the breakthrough was the slow realization among German commanders that Italy was no longer defensible as a primary war front. The resources poured into the peninsula, divisions that might have been needed elsewhere. Supply lines stretched thin across the Mediterranean. Commanders of proven skill tied down in a campaign that was slowly being lost. All of this represented a hemorrhage of German strength at a moment when strength was increasingly precious. The Waffen SS units that retreated from Monte Cassino had proven their quality as fighting formations. They had held an indefensible position far longer than military logic would have suggested possible. But holding is not the same as winning, and by May of 1944, it was already clear that Germany would not win in Italy. The only question that remained was how long the fighting would continue, and how many more lives would be spent on that continuing struggle. The mountain's shadow now stretched in a different direction. Instead of pointing toward an impending Allied collapse, it now pointed toward the German retreat, a slow, grinding withdrawal that would continue through the summer and autumn of 1944. The Waffen SS units that had defended it would eventually be withdrawn from Italy entirely, redeployed to other fronts where the desperate requirements of a losing war demanded their presence. The Gustav Line, which had promised to hold for months or perhaps years, had been broken in a matter of weeks once the Allies committed their full strength. The Liri Valley lay open, Rome lay exposed. The road northward, though still defended and still dangerous, was now traversable. The defensive battle that had consumed 5 months of killing had finally ended. But the war in Italy and the war across all of Europe continued on toward an ending that no longer required prophecy to foresee. The breakthrough came at last. In the second week of May in 1944, after 4 consecutive offensives and months of grinding attrition, the Gustav Line shattered. Polish troops raised their flag above the monastery ruins. American forces swept into the Liri Valley. The German defense, which had held for half a year with remarkable stubbornness, finally fractured under the sheer weight of overwhelming Allied numbers and firepower. What happened next was not pursuit in the traditional sense. It was something closer to a controlled collapse, a fighting withdrawal executed under conditions of mounting pressure and shrinking options. The Germans did not break and run. They retreated in phases, buying time with each position abandoned, each delaying action fought. But the mathematics had turned decisively against them. For the first time since the Salerno landings, the Allies possessed genuine strategic momentum, and the road northward lay open before them. The Liri Valley itself became the proving ground for what Allied dominance looked like when German defensive lines crumbled. Wide, rolling country with roads running north toward Rome. This was terrain that favored motorized forces moving at speed. The German army no longer had the luxury of constructing elaborate fortifications. There was no time, no manpower, no guarantee that any position would hold long enough to justify the labor. Canadian forces drove hard up the valley floor. American divisions wheeled left and right, seeking to cut off retreating German columns. British and Commonwealth troops pushed eastward toward higher ground. The German response was fragmented because it had to be. The forces defending the Gustav Line had suffered catastrophic losses. Entire battalions existed only on paper. Companies numbered fewer than 100 men. Divisions that had entered the Cassino sector with 4,000 or 5,000 troops now fielded barely half that strength. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was scarce. The supply lines running south from the German-held north had been hammered repeatedly by Allied air superiority, making even basic resupply an exercise in improvisation and desperation. The question facing German high command was deceptively simple, yet tactically complex. Where could they stand next? The Winter Line had failed. The Gustav Line, its centerpiece, had been broken. There were other fortified positions to the north, the Adolf Hitler Line, which ran across the peninsula at a narrower point further north, but whether it could be held was doubtful given the velocity of Allied advance and the exhaustion of German troops. The strategic vision that had seemed workable in autumn, when the lines were stabilizing and German defensive positions hardened, had become obsolete in the space of a few weeks. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, commanding the German 10th Army in Italy, and his superior, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, faced an agonizing calculation. They could attempt to hold another line. They could conduct a strategic withdrawal to new positions further north, or they could attempt a fighting retreat that would preserve their army's cohesion while yielding ground, hoping to eventually stabilize the situation before the Allies reached Rome. Each option carried devastating costs. Each gambled with the destruction of their remaining forces. In the end, they chose a combination of these approaches, holding here, withdrawing there, establishing rearguards and counterattack forces wherever possible to slow the Allied momentum. The American 85th Division and the British 10th Corps drove relentlessly northward. For soldiers who had spent months in static trench warfare, grinding up muddy slopes against prepared defences, this rapid movement came almost as a shock. Villages that should have been defended lay abandoned. Roads that should have been blocked were empty. German forces that should have concentrated and counterattacked instead fell back to new positions, fought brief delaying actions, and retreated again. The scale of this transformation from static to mobile warfare meant that logistics suddenly became as important as tactics. The Allies had to move supplies forward faster than their supply lines could stretch. Ammunition had to be cached at forward positions because there was no guarantee